Alright, so here it is, the Supercut, the complete version of the unused and cut video game content Iceberg. Now, if you've already seen this series, which I posted in separate parts previously, this is kind of just a complete version of that series. However, throughout, thanks to you guys in the comments, so shout out to you guys, this video will also include some bonus entries to spice it up a little bit. So stick around if you want to see some of those new entries. But I don't want to take up too much of your time with this intro. This video is already incredibly long as it is, so without further ado, let's jump into the unused and cut video game content Iceberg. Debug menu. So some of these first few ones are kind of just conceptual things. They're more so general things that are common among a lot of games. But to give a quick rundown of what a debug menu is, it's basically something that developers use in order to test various parts of their game. This can manifest in a lot of different ways. One of the common ways it's used though is what are called dev rooms or debug rooms, which can sometimes be accessed by the players in order to cheat or access unused content from the game. You've probably seen one before, even if you didn't know what it was or understand what the purpose of it was. And it's really one of, if not the most common place that unused content or cut content from games can be found. Test levels. So this one is pretty self-explanatory. This just refers to the overall concept of test levels, which are used by game developers to either test different features, maps, or mechanics within any given game, which are usually either cut from the full release of the game or hidden somewhere within the files. Definitely a pretty simple one, but this is something you'll probably see that's very common in a lot of games. Placeholders. So this could really refer to a lot of different things in terms of cut game content. They're basically used in place of something that hasn't yet been created, be that a texture, map, or just an image. Although sometimes these placeholders are forgotten or even left in the final products, and sometimes even hidden in various Easter eggs or debug rooms. There's some pretty interesting examples of placeholders being used in games before, like the placeholder text box on Hitman Blood Money that simply just says, "Alan, please add details." That one's always a classic. Regional differences. So this is another one that is kind of a broad concept that really just speaks for itself. Of course, when games are made, no matter what country they're made in, sometimes things change when they're released in other countries. Whether that be to different rating systems, different hardware or software available in different regions, or just simply language and cultural differences that don't translate. There are so many examples of differences in regional releases for games that you've probably seen at least one example while playing basically any game. Concept art. In terms of more broad categories relating to unused and cut video game content, I would say that concept art is definitely the biggest. What I mean by that is that when games are made, they go through a ton of design and creative changes. There's many different versions of characters, maps, levels, anything you can think of. Take something like BioShock for example. All of the splicers, the big daddies, the map, the levels, just the world in general. So many pieces of concept art were made for this game and it shows. As the artists can get as creative as they want and fine-tune what they're trying to create. Just go look at any game you truly love and just look at the concept art, the things that could have been for that game. It's really fascinating. There's just so many levels, enemies, bosses, so much that could have been realized in all of these games, but for one reason or another could never make it past the initial concept phase. The cutting room floor. This refers to a website that is dedicated to the discovery and research of various unused and cut content from video games. And it has been around since around 2002, and ever since, users have been cataloging various pieces of cut content from games. From simple debug material that was left in games, to full-on features and other material that have been data mined from the game's files. There's a lot to be discovered on this site, and it's definitely the hub for any type of unused game content, so if you're interested, definitely check it out. Nintendo Gigaleak. So you've probably heard about this before, This refers to the 2020 Nintendo data leak, which has since been labeled the Nintendo Giga Leak. There's really an insane amount of information to unpack here, and this could be the subject of many videos, which it has been. I mean, a ton of stuff leaked in this thing, including source codes related to the N64, GameCube, Wii, some unreleased games, emulators, concepts, debugging material, just a huge amount of Nintendo related stuff. The reason it's on this Iceberg, however, is because of a lot of the debug and unused content material. And there's quite a few interesting examples of this, such as the actual real leak of Luigi for Super Mario 64. Speaking of which, Luigi, Super Mario 64. Ah yes, the infamous playable Luigi from Super Mario 64. I'm sure if you're familiar with this game at all, you've probably heard about this, and maybe even just thought it was an urban legend. I mean, remember those old YouTube videos where they would try to unlock Luigi by doing these super complicated, like, Easter eggs? Yeah, spoiler alert, none of those actually work. However, for 25 years since the release of Super Mario 64, Luigi being in the game was simply a rumor, a gaming urban legend. That was until, of course, the Giga Leak. And to the surprise of many fans of this iconic game, a Luigi model was actually found within the development files. Definitely one of the craziest video game discoveries to date. Unused boyfriend sprites, Friday Night Funkin'. So this is a pretty well-known but simple one from the incredibly popular game Friday Night Funkin'. And yeah, it's pretty basic. Just some unused sprites and animation assets from the game. There's actually quite a list of unused assets from this game, however, this is the most well-known one, I guess. I mean, the video is literally called This, and has 1.2 million views. So yeah, I guess that's all there is to that, really. Unused girlfriend sounds, Friday Night Funkin'. This is another Friday Night Funkin' one, and one that comes from another pretty popular video. Just a couple of unused girlfriend noises. Can't believe I'm saying that in a sentence, but yeah. Why these were cut? I'm not sure. Entry number 17, Undertale. So I never really played Undertale, but I guess this is a fairly well-known one in the community as far as I'm aware. So from what I understand, entry number 17 is a sort of text file that is only available in room 264 in the game, which is known as room_gaster in the files. However, room 264 is inaccessible in the actual game, and can only be accessed through changing certain values within the text files. But when done, you get access to entry number 7, which is a series of text that is in a pixelated Wingdings font, which when translated reads this message, before eventually crashing the game. Rather than unused or cut content, this to me seems more like an Easter egg than anything else. Pokemon Gold and Silver Space World 1997 demo. So this refers to a certain early build of the original Pokemon Gold and Silver, which was first shown at Nintendo Space World 1997. This build was said to be about 80% complete and was set to be released for the original Game Boy, as the Game Boy Color hadn't even been announced yet. However, Pokemon Gold and Silver would undergo various changes and wouldn't be released until late 1999. Because of this 2-year-long gap between builds, the games were pretty different. As originally, the game was not meant to use color in any way. It was going to be released on the regular Game Boy, which was of course black and white. One of the most interesting features that was cut from this old version was a series of minigames that were actually playable. There was also some different music, different typings for Pokemon, and even entirely different and newly designed Pokemon that were unused or cut from the final version, as well as an entire region that was scrapped from this game. There are, of course, a lot of other minor differences between versions, and there's a lot of other things you could dig into with that, but for now, we'll just leave it at that. Climbable objects, Super Mario Bros. So this is our first bonus entry, and it's pretty simple. That's why it gets the first tier, I guess. But basically, this refers to an unused object which was found in the original Super Mario Bros., which was this brown thing which would operate similar to a vine in the later games. which Mario would be able to climb, to which then you could hear this interesting buzzing sound, but it can still be placed in the game using a level editor. Giant Minecraft. So this was a unused and cut mob from Minecraft that was essentially just a giant zombie, although the zombie skin might have just been a placeholder, because the giants were never officially added to Minecraft in any way and were just found within the files. As such, they can only be spawned using commands. The giants stand at 12 blocks tall, which is about 6 times the size of a zombie. And they also have no AI programmed, so they don't really react to the player or the world at all. They don't take any damage at all, and only respond to getting hit by being knocked back. They don't lose any HP, they can't actually die. It's definitely one of the stranger unused things in Minecraft. But hey, maybe it'll be fully implemented in some future update, who knows. Killer Bunny, Minecraft. Okay, I take back what I said, this is definitely weirder. So the Killer Bunny, also known as the Killer Rabbit of Carabin... What? I guess this is a Monty Python reference, but yeah. It's essentially just a hostile rabbit mob, which can only be spawned through console commands. However, the way it interacts with the player and the world is very interesting, but you don't need me to tell you that. Let's hear it from a former Mojang employee. Quote, "Once upon a build, the Killer Bunny was a natural and terrifying feature of the Minecraft overworld. Identifiable by its red horizontal eyes, burning with hate. The Killer Bunny moves faster than normal rabbits, and will set upon players and wolves, dealing an impressive amount of damage. Couldn't have said it better myself, Marsh Davies." Mob contest mobs, Minecraft. Okay, I promise this is the last Minecraft one, at least for this tier. So what I think this refers to is some of the mobs that never made the cut in the various mob votes that have taken place through Minecraft's history. What are these mob votes, you might be asking? Well, these are where I guess Minecraft players can vote on which mob will be introduced to the game, and they are given a few options and told what kind of gameplay mechanic they'll fulfill. However, only one mob can be chosen, leaving the rest to be cut and unused. Like with the 2017 vote where we got the Phantom added to the game. There were 3 other mob options that were available, those being the Barnacle, the Great Hunger, and the Wildfire, all of which were never implemented to the game since. Which is kind of a shame, some of these are pretty interesting. I don't know how the Phantom won compared to this thing, the Great Hunger, because these Phantoms, for as little as I've played Minecraft, have been a pain in the ass. I much rather would have had this guy running around, but hey, that was 2017. In fact, there was one just a couple of weeks ago, which was won by the LA mob, which is supposed to be added by next year. Stop and Swap, Banjo-Kazooie. So this is kind of a complicated one, especially to someone who isn't familiar at all with the Banjo-Kazooie franchise. Basically though, it's a complicated Easter egg located in the Banjo-Kazooie game, although it remained unfinished in the final product of the game, and it can only really be completed using cheats. This whole thing was started because if the game is beaten with 100% completion rate, some pictures are shown showing some inaccessible areas of the game, as well as some new key secret items, which would be used to unveil the next game in the series, the sequel, Banjo-Tooie. However, these secret new areas were still inaccessible after the credits, so many people were confused. The reason the Easter egg is known as Stop and Swap though, is because hackers eventually found through cheats that they were able to access these normally inaccessible areas. One of which was called Stop and Swap, which we would later find out was part of this convoluted plan that would be used by Rareware Games in order to give access to exclusive material in other games that they would make. It was a pretty revolutionary idea, however it never went through, because the only way to access this would be through a technique called hot swapping, where the player would have to turn their system on while playing Banjo-Kazooie, and then quickly swap to the Banjo-Kazooie sequel cartridge, which would give new content in that game. However, there were a couple problems with this proposed system. First of all, they wanted it to have a 10-second time limit. However, due to revisions to the N64, they would have only had 1 second to swap the cartridges, which would be extremely difficult to pull off. Not to mention, you could potentially damage your system in the process, so the whole idea was scrapped. Hidden Palace Zone, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. So this was a pretty mysterious zone that was removed pretty late into development of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which would have been a 2-stage act, and the zone where Sonic would eventually convert to Super Sonic after collecting all 7 Chaos Emeralds. However, it got changed to 1 act before eventually being completely scrapped. However, as of now, there are a lot of different playable versions of this zone available. For one, there's the Simon Y prototype leak, which contains a mostly incomplete version of what Hidden Palace Zone was meant to be. But other than that, the entire zone was actually ported to Sonic the Hedgehog 2 Remastered, which was available on iOS. The zone itself could be accessed through the Mystic Cave Zone Act 2 by falling down a pit, this being the inescapable spike pit in the original. However, in this version, the spikes are removed, and instead it gives access to the Hidden Palace Zone. Stormy Ascent, Crash Bandicoot. So this is a cut level from the original Crash Bandicoot game, which ended up being fully realized in the remastered Insane trilogy. But in the original game, it was not accessible through any normal means. However, it could be played using a Game Shark code. As to why the level was removed, a Naughty Dog employee named Andy Gavin has said, quote, "Stormy Ascent was just cut because it was too long and too hard, and we ran out of time. I wish we had put it in as some kind of Easter egg, as it was an awesome level. One of my favorite in the game. Long, a bit brutal, but it looked great, and had a real rhythm to it." Jason Rubin said, quote, "There was never anything sadder than dropping a level that was close to completion. The work that went into making a level like that is incredible. To see it on the cutting room floor was always a tragedy." End quote. But like I said before, Stormy Ascent is available in the Insane trilogy as DLC. And trust me, they didn't lie. This level is insanely hard. Hot Coffee, GTA San Andreas. So this is a pretty infamous one. It was basically a minigame that was originally in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, where you could actually have sex with your girlfriend in the game, which you would be able to do after going out on various dates with your girlfriend, at which point then you would be invited for some coffee at their house, where the minigame would end up taking place. Now, being this was the year 2004 when this game came out, this minigame created a huge wave of controversy. I mean, people were absolutely outraged that this was in the original game. However, the funniest part is, the minigame was never actually accessible in the final version. It wasn't even discovered until 2005, when a mod that was called Hot Coffee, where the name comes from, was made, which essentially just enabled the minigame that was actually present in both the PC and console versions of the game. And after this was revealed, much to the chagrin of Rockstar, San Andreas was re-rated and given an AO, or adults only rating, by the ESRB, which stopped it from being sold at a lot of retailers and in some certain countries altogether. However, Rockstar would eventually make an updated version with the minigame completely removed, which allowed the game to go back to its standard M rating. Still, it's shocking to see all these years later how much of an impact this little minigame had on the gaming world as a whole. I mean, there were protests, class action lawsuits, it was crazy. All for one cut and completely inaccessible minigame. Mr. Dream replaces Mike Tyson, Punch-Out. So for Punch-Out on the NES, who could forget the final boss? The real larger-than-life boxer Mike Tyson that the game was actually named after. Well, Nintendo did. It's not called Mike Tyson's Punch-Out anymore, it's just called Punch-Out, and features a different character called Mr. Dream instead. Now, obviously, Nintendo didn't forget about Mike Tyson, but they did remove him and his name from the game, so why is that? Well, there are a couple theories as to why, and for one, Tyson was convicted of rape, so there's that. But surprisingly, that might not actually be why. Actually, the more likely reason is just because his contract with Nintendo expired. And since he was no longer the heavyweight champion, Nintendo didn't seek to re-enter contract negotiations again, and so later copies of the game would just be called Punch-Out and would feature Mr. Dream instead of Mike Tyson, who functioned exactly the same way, but had a slightly different character sprite. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl prototype. So once again, thanks to the great Nintendo Gigaleak, we have some more Pokemon prototypes. And there are multiple builds of both Diamond and Pearl which have been put together into fully functional ROMs. And in these different prototype builds, there are many differences. One of the biggest differences being that the player character actually has a dad. There was also a different Route 201, as well as a different intro sequence that would play, as well as some other minor differences, like sprites, designs, music, that kind of stuff. Unused bosses, Cuphead. So surprisingly, there's actually a lot of cut and unused content from Cuphead. And there's quite a list of cut bosses as well. Some that are just initial and basic concepts, and even some that are almost fully realized, like the pachinko boss Pachi Pachi, and there's even actual gameplay of the boss fight on YouTube. And it even used to be accessible through the debug mode, however that no longer works due to the boss's assets being removed in one of the later updates. And there's the Demon Bat that was shown in the E3 2014 trailer that never made it into the final game. The removed airship boss, Jelly the Octopus, a giant spider guy with a hat, and Betty Beat. So yeah, there's quite a lot of cut bosses. But you know what else there is? Unused weapons and charms. Cuphead. So first of all, there was kind of a different shop than the one that's in the final game. Instead of being called Pork Rinds Emporium, it was originally known as Pork Rinds One Stop Shop. Most of the equipment had different names and descriptions too, like the heart equipment, which was originally called Health Buddy. There were also at least 5 different weapons that never made it into the final version, such as, for example, the Ranger, which was also called the Exploder in the files, which would deal more damage the farther away you were from the target. And besides weapons and shop variations, there were also 2 different charms that weren't available in the final game. Those being Pit Saver, which would prevent the player from receiving damage from pits, and would increase their invulnerability frames after taking any sort of damage, which, despite not being implemented into the game, was actually nerfed in one of the patches. And then the other charm was called Turret, but we're not exactly sure what this would have done, although we can probably guess. Although unlike Pit Saver, this one wasn't even fully coded. Wheatley Crab, Portal 2. So I got this one wrong in the original video. This video of Wheatley dancing was made as a meme, which was made using footage of the Portal 2 beta, which showcased one of Wheatley's old models and animations, which is the origin of Wheatley Crab, which was then made into many memes. But yeah, originally it was just a personality core beta model from Portal 2, which was recorded at an expo showing the footage. Michael Jackson Zombie, Plants vs. Zombies. This one is interesting because it was actually in the game at one point, until it was eventually removed. This, of course, is the original dancing zombie, which, if you've played the game before, you might recognize by this design, the disco-looking one. But that wasn't actually the original sprite that was used. It was actually this one that bore a very strong resemblance to Michael Jackson from the Thriller music video. The game first released in May 2009 with this dancing zombie. However, just a few months later, Michael Jackson would pass away. And after receiving many complaints about this zombie, asking for it to be removed, PopCap finally removed it from the game, even being contacted by Michael Jackson's estate about the issue. And since then, we've had this dancing zombie in its place. Robo Squidward, Battle for Bikini Bottom. So this game is absolutely near and dear to my heart. I grew up playing this game on the PS2, and it's absolutely great, one of my favorite games of all time. Now, the Robo Squidward boss is actually in the Game Boy Advance version of Battle for Bikini Bottom, but it's actually like a completely different game, so I don't think that really counts. What this is referring to is a cut concept of a boss called Robo Squidward for the console version of this game, which had multiple pieces of concept art showing what the boss would look like. However, of course, it ended up being cut from the game. However, in 2020, we did end up getting the amazing remaster of the game called Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, which added a bunch of previously cut and unused content from the original game, including Robo Squidward, who appears in the multiplayer mode of the game. However, unfortunately, it's not a true boss fight, and he merely only kind of appears as a background entity, but it's still a fun thing that they included. Sonic the Hedgehog prototype. This one's a fairly new addition. Being released on Hidden Palace on January 1st, 2021, this prototype build is from decades ago when the game was still in the middle of development. And there are quite a few differences within this build, although most of them are just minor changes, such as how the HUD says ring instead of rings, nor does it flash red when the player has no rings at all. There were also some different graphics and titles, along with a plethora of unused sprites within the game's code, along with a lot of missing and unimplemented features, such as the missing end cutscenes, as well as no continue screen at all. All the other small changes and details can be found on the cutting room floor, or on the actual compiled ROM if you choose to play it. Henchman dying, Friday Night Funkin'. So these henchman characters that appear during week 4 in Friday Night Funkin' were actually going to be killed off during one of the tracks by getting hit by a light post. And although this was a planned and talked about feature, it was eventually scrapped to save on development time. Although one of the developers, Phantom Arcade, has stated that this feature will be implemented sometime in the future. And the animation of the henchman getting hit by the light post has since been found and uploaded to YouTube, where it can now be viewed, although it still hasn't been implemented yet into the game. Beta monster designs, Friday Night Funkin'. So there's a ton of old and unused assets for Friday Night Funkin'. That includes art, tracks, and even miscellaneous sounds. There's a ton of sketches for the various characters within this game, such as this sketch of Monster. Yeah, this thing is pretty creepy. Motos, Super Mario 64. Once again, thanks to the gift that just keeps on giving, Nintendo's Giga Leak of 2020, data miners have uncovered an unused and cut enemy from the Super Mario 64 beta. And it's thought that these were likely the predecessors of the bully enemy, which was introduced in this game. They're little robot guys that attack Mario by first picking him up and then running over to lava and throwing him in. But they can also be defeated in the same way, by picking them up and throwing them into lava, which would then reward Mario with a blue coin after they were defeated. Walking turret, Portal. So while Portal 2 was in development, Valve made this sort of ARG called Potato Fool's Day in 2011 that was used to promote and hype up the release of Portal 2, which is where the walking turret was first revealed in the form of concept art. Their designs are simple enough and very similar to the standard sentry turrets from Portal 1, although it was said that these walking turrets would be able to follow the player around and even enter portals as shown in one of the concept arts. As to why the walking turrets were never implemented in Portal 2, a Valve animator said that, quote, "they didn't work well as a game mechanic." Illusioner, Minecraft. So the Illusioner was an unused Illager NPC that would cast spells and shoot a bow at the player. However, the Illusioners have no spawn egg and can only be spawned using a command. Unlike the other Illagers in Minecraft though, they do not spawn in woodland mansions, raids, or pillager outposts. And like the giant mob that we discussed earlier, they don't naturally spawn in any sort of biome. And so while not cut from the game entirely, they've never really been implemented either. They kind of remain unused. These NPCs are pretty interesting though, and can even fight the player and uses some pretty interesting tactics, such as using invisibility spells and duplicate spells, creating multiple fake clones of itself, which I guess is the gimmick of this NPC. But as of now, they remain an unused entity in Minecraft. Zombie Horse, Minecraft. So this is another unused mob, and it's basically just a variation of a horse, although with a cool green zombie-like texture. They can be spawned using a command or with a spawn egg, which is really interesting. I mean, it feels like this was really meant to be in the full game. It was added in updates through many different versions of the game on many different systems, including even the DS version. These horses acted almost like regular horses, except they would slowly regenerate health and were known to be much faster. However, as of now, they cannot be tamed unless you use some sort of command. Still though, the zombie horse remains unused to this day. Sky Dimension, Minecraft. So this so-called sky dimension, or as it's also simply known just as sky, was intended to be kind of the opposite of the nether, and was a planned dimension within Minecraft, which would be like a set of floating islands in the sky. Notch even confirmed the update himself in a tweet when he said, quote, "And because PC Gamer made such a big deal of the sky dimension, I guess I'll have to finish it. Consider it confirmed." And some of the features were even partially implemented. And by using a buffet world type, a player would be able to generate a partial recreation of what this concept was. However, it was never officially implemented into the game, as we now know. This was probably due to many reasons, but one of those was, according to a Mojang employee, that, quote, "It didn't work so well because of how light is calculated." And so this concept of a sky dimension was later rebranded into what is now known as The End, completely changing this original idea into something else entirely. But who knows, maybe in some future update we'll get a different version of the sky dimension. Placeface, Baldi's Basics. So this was an unimplemented character and sort of Easter egg within the Baldi's Basics series. It appears as a disembodied floating human head, and can only be found in the original game through the test room. However, in the original version, strangely, the placeface was invisible. But in a later update, when entering the test room, you would be greeted with two placefaces. One would stay in the room, while another one would follow the player around the map until they look back at them. However, besides this little Easter egg, they're not really fully implemented in the game. Mel, Portal. So Mel was the original planned protagonist of Portal 2. Sporting a different, albeit very similar character model to Shell, the game's previous protagonist. However, at some point in development, that idea was scrapped and Shell returned as the protagonist for Portal 2. However, Mel wasn't immediately cut entirely. In fact, Mel was going to be used alongside Shell for the game's co-op mode. And there are even screenshots of this human test subject co-op from the documentary The Final Hours of Portal 2, which catalogs some of the game's development. However, this was also cut, and Mel and Shell were swapped with Android test subjects Atlas and Peabody. As to why Mel never became the game's protagonist, it's been stated that early game testers found that they were extremely disappointed when GLaDOS didn't recognize the player's character. However, Mel would end up being the protagonist of the Portal 2 mod, Portal Stories Mel, in which she is the main character of that game, and actually sports a unique character design, unlike the sort of palette swap placeholder skin she had previously. Playable Alucard and Decidueye, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Okay, so unfortunately these two characters were actually planned for the game's base roster, but ended up being scrapped. In fact, Sakurai revealed in an interview with Nintendo Dream that Decidueye would have been the Pokemon to represent Generation 7 as the playable character. However, Incineroar ended up being chosen instead, and so Decidueye was cut from the game, citing that Sakurai wanted to make a character with more of a professional wrestler type of moveset. As for Alucard, well, Sakurai knew he wanted to add some sort of a Castlevania character to the Smash Bros. Series, and he knew Alucard was very popular, so he was kind of their first pick. However, Simon and Richter Belmont ended up being chosen instead, as Sakurai believed this is what the fans would prefer. Flood Juggernaut, Halo 2. So if you've ever played the Halo games before, you probably know about the Flood. They're gross, infectious space zombies with many different forms, as they're able to take over and control the many different species throughout the Halo universe. And one of the most interesting Flood forms was one we didn't even get to see in the game that it was planned to be in, that being Halo 2. It was a huge and powerful kind of mini-boss type of Flood form, which could have potentially filled a hunter-like role but for the Flood. However, unfortunately, this enemy type was never added into Halo 2, at least not in any official capacity. Modders actually figured out a way to spawn these Flood Juggernauts, and they actually kind of work. At least they have some AI programmed behavior, and will attack other Covenant enemies, complete with various attacking and yelling animations. Although I don't think this is entirely how the final version of the Flood Juggernaut was meant to operate. But yeah, it's a very interesting enemy, and I really wish they did implement it into Halo 2. But if you're a Halo fan, as you know, this game was already incredibly rushed as is, and it probably didn't work too well within the game. I mean, it's easily already the hardest Halo in the series, especially on Legendary, so yeah, I can see why they cut it. Although it did ended up being added to Halo Fireteam Raven, a Halo on-rails arcade shooter made in 2018. Fortigreen, Among Us. Named after one of the developers of the game, Fortigreen, or Forte Green, Fort Green, however you want to say it, is a sort of glitched color that cannot actually be selected by the player. Instead, it can only be assigned during a glitch that happens when you join a lobby, which somehow causes an error with the server not recognizing the name of said player, which then gives that player this color, as well as changes their name to simply 3 question marks. However, before the 2021.4.2 update, the name would actually be changed to Fortabass, which was the name of the developer that this was referencing. Another interesting thing is that it's very similar to just the regular green color, so it can be very confusing in game. And it also spawns a whole new set of glitches when a player is assigned this color. For one, the emergency menu can't be accessed normally. The player can't be scanned, and they can't even open their personal menu or sabotage menu if they're imposter. So yeah, if you accidentally end up getting this glitch, you're kind of f***ed. I think the reason it's on this Iceberg though is because it was intended to be a placeholder for testing the server functionality, and ended up being left in, although it can't be accessed normally and can only be used through this glitch. Doge, Undertale. So yeah, apparently there was a cut Doge enemy for Undertale, complete with sprites, animations, code, everything really. The design was simply just a dog wearing armor that wielded a spear, which had similar attack animations to the lesser dog enemy. But yeah, it's pretty basic. I'm not sure why this ended up actually being cut though. RGO3 and RGO4 Undertale. So these are 2 more cut enemies from Undertale, and they appeared as Royal Guard Knights that were very similar to RGO1 and RGO2, with RGO4 being more of a cat-like knight, and RGO3 being more like a mantis. Just like the previous enemy, there's tons of text, quotes, and code that's available for these enemies, and it's really unknown why they were left out in the final version. Hover turrets, Portal 2. So the hover turret, otherwise known as the laser turret, was an unused entity that was planned to be in Portal 2, and can be found within the game's files. However, when trying to spawn this turret, only an error placeholder model will appear instead. Although it was said that despite its name, the turret didn't actually hover, but instead was suspended by a cable from the ceiling. And the turret itself was programmed to slowly rotate when idle until it found a player within its field of view, which would then prompt it to fire at the player with a laser. There is a fan mod recreation of the hover turret which can be used in the game, as well as official screenshots from the Portal 2 documentary The Final Hours, which show the hover turrets functioning as they would have, presumably, in the final game. Unused classes, TF2. So there is a ton of unused content in TF2. And among the various maps and weapons that were never fully implemented in the game, there are actually full-on classes that were planned but were never actually used. For one, there were scrapped female concept arts of the various different classes in the game, as there was an internal pitch project to bring female characters to the cast of Team Fortress 2. There is even code related to using these female models in the game. However, there was only one official model of any class that was actually made, which was the female soldier model, which was created in 2009. However, none of these assets were ever used. Then there's the, of course, infamous civilian scrapped class from TF2, which would have presumably operated similarly to the classic civilian class from Team Fortress Classic. The planned TF2 version, however, didn't have a specific model for the class, and instead by default used the Scout model. The class also had very low health, the lowest of any class within the game, and did not possess any weapons and could not attack in any way. There were also no animations, and playing as the class would just allow you to T-pose around essentially. And last but not least, there was actually a commander scrapped class in TF2, which was originally planned to operate very differently from the rest, with the class simply overlooking the map, providing air support, placing buildings, and communicating tactics with other players on his team. However, this concept ended up being scrapped pretty early in development, as this concept would have been for when TF2 was more of a realistic game, in the sense that it was more of a standard war type shooter, back when it was titled Team Fortress 2 Brotherhood of Arms. However, the concept behind the commander class ended up being reworked into what is now the coaching system for the game, which allows players to provide feedback to others and help coach them through their gameplay. Kamek, Mario Kart 64. So back when Mario Kart 64 was first being developed and it was first known as Super Mario Kart R, Kamek was intended to be one of the playable racers in the game, and can even be seen on a player select screen from the Mario Kart 64 beta build. However, he never made it into the final cut, and was replaced by Donkey Kong. Most of the other characters' designs were also different during the beta build, so when polishing up these characters, that's maybe when they decided to use Donkey Kong instead of Kamek. However, he would eventually make his debut in a Mario racing game with Mario Kart Tour almost 25 years later. R-Wing, Ocarina of Time. So R-Wings, which you might recognize as the vehicles used in the Star Fox series, were actually planned to be enemies in Ocarina of Time. This unused enemy ended up being found in the game's files, and interestingly, when it was actually spawned, and Link would enter an area with an R-Wing in it, a small cutscene would play showing the ship appearing, and then it would proceed to actually shoot at Link with its lasers. As to why this was left in the game, well, it's thought that this enemy type was used to test the flight patterns which would be used for Volvagia. As one of the developers said in an interview, quote, "Volvagia is a dragon, so it wriggles and undulates. I only gave Morita-san the dragon model parts, but he set it in motion immediately. It was mysterious how he could do that. I couldn't help but ask how he did it, and he said it was the same as the programming for Star Fox 64. Mortal Kombat characters, NBA Jam. So this one is pretty wild. In the NBA Jam Tournament Edition for arcade, released in 1994, there were a total of 8 banned and subsequently cut characters from the game. 4 of those characters being Mortal Kombat ones, Raiden, Sub-Zero, Reptile, and Scorpion, which could be accessed using passwords. As to why they were banned and subsequently removed from future versions, well, that was due to NBA themselves. I guess they weren't a fan of these violent video game characters being associated with their brand of basketball. Interestingly enough though, in the versions with the Mortal Kombat characters available, there were actually fatality Easter eggs in the game. And these characters can still be played in revisions 1 and 2 of this game. Episode 51, Metal Gear Solid 5. So this refers to a cut episode or mission from MGS5 called Episode 51, also referred to as the Phantom episode or Kingdom of the Flies, which was never actually included in Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain due to time constraints. However, there is footage that exists of this cut mission that was shown in the Blu-ray disc that came with the collector's edition of the game, and would have involved Snake pursuing Eli as well as some other child soldiers in Africa. And although it is labeled as episode 51 on the collector's disc, it's thought that by some it chronologically would have taken place earlier. Still though, it's pretty interesting, and there was definitely a lot of work that went into these cutscenes, so it's really a shame it never got finished and put into the game. Animatronics staring at the camera, Five Nights at Freddy's. Okay, so remember when I talked about the Mandela effect in that last Iceberg video I did about fake lost media? Which if you haven't seen it, go check it out, it's a pretty cool video. Anyway, yeah, this is kind of an interesting case of the Mandela effect at work. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, just look at this image. I mean, if you've played Five Nights at Freddy's, I feel like you would remember this. I mean, I didn't even really play the game that much back when it came out, but I feel like I saw this image playing through the game. And so many others think that they remember it too, but it actually wasn't in the game. At least not in the original PC version of the game. Although it was in one of the trailers, and it is an unused asset within the game's files. So maybe most of us are remembering it from the trailer, but I'm not really sure. Apparently it is in the mobile version of the game, but I've never actually played that version. And so it is an unused screen in the PC version of the game that can only be found by looking through the game's files. Tharia Trophy, Super Smash Bros. For 3DS. So back when Smash Bros. 4 was being developed, there was some leaked ESRB footage from the game, which showed a trophy of the character Tharia that was originally planned for the game. However, when the game was eventually released, the trophy was noticeably absent. And even looking through the game's files, there was no data related to this trophy at all in the final game, suggesting that maybe the trophy was removed because of the game's rating, as the ESRB might have thought that her outfit was a little too suggestive for the ESRB's E10 plus rating that Nintendo was looking for this game. That's the theory anyway, we actually don't know for sure. However, a very similar situation happened with the North American release of Fire Emblem Awakening, which had quite a few alterations, removing quote adult content from the game. Turret Birds, Cuphead. So in Cuphead, there's a boss called Wally Warbles, which is a sort of bird boss that can be found in Inkwell Isle 2, appearing in the level Aviary Action, which is an airplane level of the game. But back when the game was in earlier development, there was an alternative version of this boss fight that featured a turret bird minion that was also in the fight, that was cut for unknown reasons. Although it's theorized that they were cut because they were too similar to the Zeppelin enemies from the Hildeberg boss fight. And there is actual footage of them being used in the game, however they are missing their art assets and animation, and are simply replaced with one of the developers' heads instead. Celestial Tools, Terraria. Okay, so in Terraria, once you get to hard mode, some of the final bosses that you fight are these various towers that are called the Celestial Pillars. Each of the various pillars are unique, which has different enemies and different rewards when you finally destroy them. These are the Solar Pillar, the Vortex Pillar, Nebula Pillar, and Stardust Pillar, which will all give you a different fragment corresponding to that pillar, which can then be used to craft various items, including a Luminite pickaxe, which as far as I'm aware, these are the second strongest pickaxes in the game, with them only being beaten out by the laser drill narrowly. However, in terms of actual tools, you can only use these fragments to make a hamaxe or a pickaxe, as well as a variety of weapons and armor. Although it was found that there existed Luminite hammers and axes, although they are unattainable and cannot actually be crafted. And these were most likely scrapped in order to just have a hamaxe which served both purposes. Removed weapons, Terraria. Okay, so there are quite a few unobtainable and removed weapons in Terraria. Of course, there are the Luminite axes and hammers we talked about earlier, but there were also Luminite chainsaws, which I guess could also be included in the previous entry. There's also a prototype of the Terrablade sword called the First Fractal, an unobtainable skull bow, and even an axe called Soul Scythe, which was a reference to the Soul Eater anime franchise, which may have been the reason for its removal. There was also even an NES zapper-like gun called the Zappinator, which was removed for obvious reasons. Mario Kart Wii Mission Mode. So this was a unused and incomplete game mode that would have been available in Mario Kart Wii, that would most likely function similarly to the Mario Kart DS version of Mission Mode. However, the Wii version was eventually cancelled and hidden away within the files, and was replaced by Tournament Mode. The Mission Mode, however, would have had the player go through a series of challenges, about 64 in fact, with increasing difficulty, wherein which the player would have to complete a certain objective within a time limit. Some of these objectives have even been revealed within the game's files, such as completing laps, getting certain drift scores, breaking item boxes, hitting enemies, gathering coins, and even performing wheelies. And it's actually even possible to play this mode, albeit in a very buggy state using cheat codes. So yeah, it doesn't work too well. And it also has the potential to damage your save file, so be careful. Patrick's Dream, Battle for Bikini Bottom. Yet another piece of cut content from Battle for Bikini Bottom. So if you've played the game, you probably remember Patrick's Dream. Or maybe you don't, because it's so strange and short. It's literally just the blankness of Patrick's mind where he gives SpongeBob a spatula. There's really no other gameplay to it. And yeah, it's kind of a funny joke about the character, but this wasn't the original planned level for Patrick's Dream. In fact, it would have included an entire platforming section rather than whatever this was. And while the level was never finished and went unused, it can actually still be loaded and played within the original version of the game by manipulating some files. However, obviously it's not finished and it's extremely buggy. Although you can definitely see what they were trying to go for here, and there are even enemy placements, environmental hazards, and even a golden spatula at the end of it. Oh yeah, and because the skybox doesn't really work properly, this ends up happening when you try to play the level, making it a pretty trippy experience. Glove World, Battle for Bikini Bottom. So unlike Patrick's Dream, you can't actually find this level within the game's files. And as far as we know, it wasn't actually even made and may have only been a planned feature. The only actual reference to its existence at all within the game was found in an early version of the pause menu that was accessed through the game's files when looking through the taxi system, which showed an area called Glove World. Although some theorize that this may have just been an early version of the Goo Lagoon level. Or maybe they did plan on making Glove World, but it was scrapped early on in development. Either way, this supposed area is completely cut from the game entirely. Yoshi, Super Mario Bros. Okay, so this one was a little confusing to research, and granted, I don't know very much about Mario at all, but what I think this is referring to is Yoshi being in Super Mario Bros. 1, and it was merely the concept, the idea behind Yoshi that was cut from this game. As Miyamoto wanted Mario to ride a dinosaur-like creature throughout the game, although due to the technical limitations of the NES, this couldn't really be done. And so Yoshi wasn't officially introduced until Super Mario World. Hino Curry, Super Mario Sunshine. So in Super Mario Sunshine, there's a pretty strange, unused giant enemy called Hino Curry 2, although this is only his name within the actual files. But if the enemy was spawned into the game, it would proceed to drop the swoop and stew enemies from a nozzle on its back, and the player would fight it by spraying water at it until its outer shell would pop, to which then Mario could simply jump on it until it dropped 1 coin. Blarg, Super Mario 64. So Blarg is of course an enemy that is found in Super Mario World. However, Super Mario 64 also contained an unfinished model for a Blarg enemy, although it does appear eyeless and untextured, with a couple of animations that show him sitting in lava and jumping out of it. And some additional code related to the enemy was even found during the Nintendo Giga Leak. Rosalina in Super Mario Odyssey. So this one is pretty simple. It essentially just refers to this scrapped piece of concept art of what Rosalina would look like in the Super Mario Odyssey art style or game, which shows her wearing a t-shirt and jeans as well as playing the guitar. This piece of concept art was found in the Art of Super Mario Odyssey book, which released in Japan in 2018. Gears, Minecraft. So gears were a type of block that were added to Minecraft on January 28th, 2010. However, as early as July 2nd, they were completely removed from the game, as they didn't have any clearly defined purpose or functionality. And for the brief time that gears were actually in Minecraft, they could only be obtained through the use of inventory editors. As for the purpose of gears, we can only really speculate, although some people think it would have been somewhat of a precursor to Redstone, which was added into the game around the time gears were completely removed. Hat Adult, A Hat in Time. So this was simply an adult version of Hat Kid that was scrapped from the final game, who appeared in a brief playable segment of the alpha and beta versions of the game. Although it was later stated in an interview by one of the developers that Hat Adult would play a more significant role in the story, similar to what Adult Link did in The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And it was said that the game would even feature a time-branching mechanic, where you could play as the Hat Adult representing different timelines. However, this all was of course cut from the final game, although her model and animations can still be found in the game files. Additional subjects, Baldi's Basics. So if you've ever played Baldi's Basics before, you probably know that when you go into the classroom to answer a question, it's always a math-related one, even when going to separate classrooms. However, that wasn't originally the intention of the developer. He actually wanted to include a different subject for every classroom, including science, spelling, geology, English, history, math, and geography. However, he realized that subjects like history and spelling might alienate players that don't actually live in the USA. And so, in the original version of the game, there's of course only math. However, there is an unused voice clip from Baldi relating to the spelling subject. And through hacking, there were a bunch of unused assignments for every subject in the game, each represented by a different colored notebook. Piranha Plant's third jump, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. So this one is pretty self-explanatory. The Piranha Plant character, which was added into the cast of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, was originally planned to have a third jump instead of just two. And there's even an unused animation related to this third jump that was found in the game's files. And I don't really play this game at all, but according to some of the tier lists I looked at, yeah, this guy probably could have used that third jump. Beta costumes, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. So this just refers to beta recolors of certain characters that weren't present in the final release of the game, such as for Ridley, Ice Climbers, Pokemon Trainer, and Villager. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Pretty simple. Unused playtime and principal lines, Baldi's Basics. So there are actually quite a few pieces of cut audio that were either removed in updates from the game's files, or were cut from the game before it was even released. Some of the most well-known ones, however, are the cut principal voice lines. But they are pretty basic, telling the player not to run in the halls, things like that. However, there were also cut whistling lines, which may have been planned to be used to alert the player of the principal's presence throughout the game. As for the character of Playtime, well, there's quite a few cut voice lines as well, mostly related to her jump rope, including one where she would teach the player how to actually use the jump rope. Goggles, Sonic the Hedgehog. So for the original release of Sonic the Hedgehog for the Genesis in 1991, there are these cut monitors in the game that are only visible if you fly over the goal in debug mode or use a level wrapping glitch. One of these monitors that could be viewed showed a pair of goggles, which ended up being unused in the final game, and some people theorized that they might have actually been one of Sonic's power-ups originally. Because in the 2013 remake of the game, Sonic can now actually break the goggles monitor, which will give him the goggles when he appears underwater, which actually increases the time you can spend underwater without air. And the actual sprites for this goggles power-up were taken from the original files of the game. However, one of the developers of the remake has stated that the original goggles from the 1991 version were never actually meant to be a power-up, and were instead just a cosmetic graphic. The door behind the cleric beast, Bloodborne. So if you've never played Bloodborne before, I think it could be best described as Lovecraftian, gothic, mysterious, dark. Any of these adjectives could really be used to describe not only the locations, bosses, and monsters, but also just the game's overall atmosphere. And when playing the game and coming across what is called the Great Bridge, you'll find yourself fighting the first boss of the game, the Cleric Beast. And beyond him, at the end of the bridge, you'll find this seemingly innocuous door, which has no prompt and can actually be opened through normal means. But if you manage to make your way past the door, you'll end up finding a very empty area, although there is a strange lever hidden beneath the area, and although it can be pulled, it does nothing. However, it's thought that this door was actually a planned shortcut that could be accessed later on through the game, when you find a door that looks very similar to the other side of that door on the Great Bridge, which also cannot be opened at all throughout the game. However, in an alpha version of Bloodborne, there was actually a prompt for this shortcut door, although that ended up being cut, of course. And interestingly, in this area, for the alpha version of Bloodborne, there was a very creepy soundtrack that would be played in this area called False God Hymn, which would have been used for the Amygdala boss, although it was eventually changed into another soundtrack. Unused costumes, Super Mario Odyssey. So in Super Mario Odyssey, there are a ton of unused and cut costumes in the game, such as a Link costume. There was also a different Diddy Kong outfit that was found in the files that had different textures from the one found in the game. But those are just the ones found in the files. In terms of unused concepts and artwork, there are a ton. Like literally pages worth of artwork full of different costumes for Mario that never actually made it into the game, unfortunately. Blur, story mode. So first, I gotta shout out Ace Arrow, who not only brought this to my attention, but also found the cutscenes for this. But let me back up for a second. So Blur is a racing game from 2010, developed by Bizarre Creations and published by Activision. The game also actually featured real cars and locations, but it still has that kind of arcadey-like gameplay. And there was also a bunch of unused cutscenes for a story mode which were found that are fully animated and voice acted. However, for some reason, they were cut. Presumably because Activision wasn't too concerned with a story mode in the game, and rather they just wanted the multiplayer to be the main focus of the game. And so these lost cutscenes were found thanks to Ace Arrow after looking through an old PS3 debug build of the game. And these cutscenes can now be watched on YouTube. Latican, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. So this was actually a cut Pokemon from the Ruby and Sapphire beta versions that was called by fans Latican, as it appears similar to Latias and Blaziken. But we have no real official name of what this Pokemon would have been, as it ended up being cut from Ruby and Sapphire, and its only appearance was in the beta versions of these games. Purple Yoshi and Brown Yoshi, Yoshi's Story. So in early builds of the game, there was apparently going to be playable brown and purple Yoshis, as seen in early footage from the game as well as some screenshots. However, these two ended up being replaced by pink and white Yoshi in the final game. River Monster, Red Dead Redemption 2. I know we just kind of speed ran through a lot of those really simple ones, but this one is pretty interesting, I think. And as we all know, Rockstar loves to put their cryptids and urban legends in their games. So I don't think it's really that surprising that this audio called a River Monster was found in the game's files. Although still, it's pretty unsettling. But it's not just the audio file that was found in the game's files. There's actually a file name that's called A_C_River_Monster01, which was actually meant to be a model, although it was never actually fully created, and instead we're just left with this string of text. And interestingly enough, this entity could actually be looted, and would contain crustacean meat, although the river monster could not be skinned like other animals. Although it's really unknown how this river monster would have interacted with the world, or whether it would have been a part of some sort of mission. Regardless, it's a very interesting piece of unused and cut content, and a very interesting gaming mystery as a whole. Unused animations, Team Fortress 2. So since there's so much unused and cut content from TF2, there is a load of animations that go with those things. For one, there were actually grenades that were planned to be in Team Fortress 2, which were complete with holster and unholster animations that were found within the game's files. There were also a series of cut burning animations, which were all most likely unique death animations for the different classes throughout the game. There's also a ton of unique robot animations for the man versus machine mode, which ended up being cut from the game, as well as additional cut taunts and cut weapon animations. Although Valve has gone on to add previously unused emotes in the past in updates. So who knows, maybe at some point Valve will have a use for all these unused animations. Although I kinda doubt it, they never really update this game. Alright, moving on. Final level, Metal Gear Solid 5. Okay, I never really talked about this in the first part when I mentioned Metal Gear Solid 5, but really, this game is the holy grail of unused and cut content. I mean, I already love the game as is, but looking at this huge list, I just feel like the game is incomplete. There's just so much. But if you've played and beaten the game before, you'll know the game ends with Mission 46. However, of course, there were many planned missions beyond that, as we already covered the cut episode 51 in part 1 of this Iceberg. But episode 51 wasn't the final mission either, or at least it wasn't meant to be. It was actually going to be somewhat of an extra epilogue mission rather than the official conclusion, with episode 50 being the final level in terms of the main story, I guess. But this whole thing is very confusing because there are actually missions 47 through 50. However, they're not new missions, rather they are just extreme versions of previous missions, and mission 46 is the actual last new mission in the game. The point is though, we were going to get a different final level from what we got. And we don't know for sure what the final mission would have looked like, but on the official Metal Gear Twitter account, it was stated that the lost mission 51 was definitely not going to be the ending. Anyway, there's a whole lot more you can dig into with the ending of Metal Gear Solid as well as other planned features and missions, but I'll just leave it here for now. Capsule Monsters. So Capsule Monsters was a very early design concept of what would become Pokemon, created by Satoshi Tajiri, and was first proposed to Nintendo in the early 90s. The name being inspired by Japanese gashapon machines, which would contain capsule toys, hence the name Capsule Monsters. Not only the name was different though, as a lot of the mechanics were initially very different, such as instead of catching Pokemon using balls during combat, there was actually going to be a planned charisma stat that would be used to actually recruit the Pokemon. Also strangely, it seems like instead of the Pokemon or monsters at this stage fighting each other, it would be the trainers who would fight possibly. And there's a bunch of artwork that shows off these planned features and more, even including early concepts of monsters that would become Pokemon we know today, such as Rhydon. Skinless Hush, Binding of Isaac. So in Binding of Isaac, there's a boss called Hush, which is this weird thing that starts off looking kind of like Isaac, but then turns into this thing. However, what some people might not know is that there was this very creepy, unused, and unfinished sprite for a skinless Hush, which was found in the game's files for Binding of Isaac Rebirth. And although it is unused, it has since been made into a mod that you can actually use to replace the skin of a standard Hush with the skinless Hush. It's also been stated that the skinless Hush was never actually planned to be used and was simply a red herring left for data miners. Early character designs, Ace Attorney. So in one of the official Japanese guidebooks for the series, some concept art for early character designs were revealed. Some characters, such as Phoenix Wright, were a lot more subdued and kind of basic, but then there were ones like Miles Edgeworth, which were completely different from what we ended up with. Spore, 2005. So when the video game Spore was first showcased and demonstrated at GDC 2005, there were a lot of listed and shown features that ended up being removed or were possibly cut from the game. For example, blood had actually been seen in one of the demos. However, that was of course eventually removed as they wanted to make the game more appropriate for younger audiences. Behaviors of the various creatures were also different and tended to actually be a little bit more realistic than what we see in the game nowadays. There were also various tools that were removed, such as a hut editor, as well as shops, which were only a concept but were never actually put into the game. And there was also apparently even going to be a feature where you could kidnap members of another tribe and convert them into your own. Even being able to kidnap babies from another tribe. Yeah. And there's a whole host of other things that were cut or removed from the 2005 demo version of Spore. And among those were the various stages, which, speaking of, aquatic stage, Spore. So this was an unreleased and removed stage from Spore that never actually made it into the final version of the game. In the stage itself, it was said there were going to be various different kinds of creatures, such as different fish, amphibians, and reptiles. And there is even some concept art of the designs of these various creatures. There were also concepts of underwater civilizations that were going to be introduced, but among other things, there were a lot of problems going into the design of this stage, such as the environment just being very glitchy due to the amount of animations that were going to be used, as the aquatic world was said to be very large. There were also issues with the textures and the camera. I mean, it was just kind of a mess. And so the stage was cut, never to be added back into the game as of yet. Forbidden 7, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. So the Forbidden 7, as they are called, or sometimes also known as the Forgotten 7, are 7 characters who never actually made it into Super Smash Bros. Brawl. These 7 including Roy, Mewtwo, Dr. Mario, Dixie Kong, Toon Zelda, Tetra or Toon Sheik, and Plusil and Minun. Now, these characters obviously weren't included in the actual game, and the only reason they're even known to exist at all is because their names were found on a Smash Bros. Sound file by hackers. And this is really the only evidence of their existence within the game, besides a couple of internal sound references. So yeah, these were most likely planned, but never actually created characters for Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Punk Clique. Bully. So the punks were a clique that were actually cut very early in the development of Bully, and they are actually officially shown in the comic strip that comes with the limited edition of Bully, with 4 of the 5 known members being shown in the comic strip. And due to some data mining, we actually found out quite a bit of interesting information about the punks. First of all, we have a couple of character models that were going to be used for the clique, as well as the fact that there was actually going to be a whole different system in regards to bullying in the game, where it was planned that some non-clique students would bully other non-clique students, but due to the difficulty of programming this, the bullying students were actually given their own clique. And so instead of using the punks as a clique, they split it up into the bullies and the dropouts. And interestingly enough, the leader of the Dropouts clique uses one of the models that would have been used for the punks, Yummer. Okay, so if you watch Oddheader's videos, you might have heard about this one. So in a seemingly innocuous SpongeBob Flash game released in 2019 titled SpongeBob Saves the Day, there was a pretty disturbing discovery within the game's files. That being this graphic right here, called the Yummer within the files. And yeah, it's pretty disturbing, especially for being in a kid's game, right? But it was eventually discovered that he originally was created about 10 years ago as a modeling test. And the model was used at the office as sort of a joke, but also just a placeholder, as it was very recognizable. And of course, as we know, they forgot to remove him. Whoops. Character D. Pikmin 3. So Pikmin 3 went through many changes during its development, many which were actually seen in the beta version of the game, as there was a lot of content from this beta that ended up being unused or cut entirely. But one of these characters that was cut wasn't even shown in the beta, and didn't actually even appear in the game at all in any way, and was only shown off at E3 2012, and was only known as the character D. And it's thought by fans that he may have been one of the playable captains at one point. Rubies, Minecraft. So before emeralds, rubies were actually going to be used as trading currency for villagers in the Minecraft Java Edition 1.3. However, interestingly enough, the reason they changed from rubies to emeralds was because one of the game's developers, Dinnerbone, actually suffered from some red-green color blindness, and therefore would have a hard time differentiating between redstone ore and ruby ore, which, yes, was actually going to be mineable. And a lot of the textures and files related to rubies still exist within Minecraft's files. Adhesion Gel, Portal 2. So Adhesion Gel was a cut gel type from Portal 2 that was meant to function as somewhat of a sticky gel, which would allow the player to actually walk on walls and ceilings of test chambers. However, when the final game was released, The adhesion gel, which was found within the files, actually had no effect, and it ended up being removed before the game was released. As to why this concept was scrapped, it was stated in the final hours of Portal 2 developer commentary that playtesters using this adhesion gel became very disoriented when trying to do test chamber puzzles while being upside down and sideways on the walls. However, the adhesion gel has been used and re-implemented in many community maps and mods. Scarecrow, Manhunt. So as a quick side note, Manhunt is one of my favorite games. It's truly a unique horror stealth experience. But in both of the games, there's quite a bit of cut content. Unsurprisingly, because both of these games are extremely controversial, as they're known for their extreme violence. So yeah, no surprise that there's a lot of cut content within these games. And sometime maybe I'll do a deep dive into all the cut content from both of these games. But for now, we're talking about Scarecrow, which is a very interesting cut character, who would have acted as the former leader of the gang, the Smileys, and was actually shown through a piece of concept art that he was actually responsible for the quote, Pigsy debacle. If you played the game, I think you know what I'm talking about. Interestingly, he would have acted similarly to the Tramp in the game, where he could have been encountered as merely a homeless person, at least at first glance, before donning his mask and becoming the Scarecrow, wielding a homemade axe. And this could have honestly been a really interesting mechanic and boss fight if that's what they were going for. So like a lot of other cut content from this game, it's really a shame Scarecrow didn't make it into the final game. Undead King Jayurl, Dark Souls. So this was a cut and unused boss from the original Dark Souls, which was unofficially named Undead King Jayurl. It's unknown exactly where this boss fight would have taken place, although a lot of people seem to think it would have been located in New Londo ruins. Other than that, it was also found that the character would have actually used a moveset similar to Old King Allant from Demon's Souls. The boss itself also would have had a unique curved greatsword, as well as a unique light armor set, which might have been available to the player upon completing this boss fight. Other than that though, it remains unclear why this was actually cut from the game. Prometheus, Batman Arkham Knight. This one's pretty simple and straightforward. But basically, one of the DLCs for Batman Arkham Knight was called Season of Infamy. And from this DLC, two key characters ended up being cut, those being Black Mask and Prometheus. However, there's not really that much to look into here, and besides a couple references within the game's files, there was this piece of concept art for Prometheus. But that's pretty much it. Unused potions, Minecraft. So there's a couple of potions as well as some status effects that remain unused in Minecraft. Firstly, there's a potion called the Uncraftable Potion for obvious reasons, which really just serves as a general placeholder for potions and potion effects within the game's files. There was also found to be potions that give negative effects, such as things like wither, nausea, stuff like that. Although these also cannot be crafted or brewed. Unused Yuri and Natsuki expressions, Doki Doki Literature Club. So this is another pretty basic one, just some unused expressions from two of the characters. And I guess this one for Natsuki was actually removed in one of the updates, although these creepy ones for Yuri stayed for whatever reason. Alternate costumes, Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl. So this one's pretty interesting because this game is pretty new, and it actually came out only a little over a month ago from when this video is being made. Anyway, there's quite a lot of cut content from this game, including cut characters, levels, concept arts, items. I mean, there's really a lot here. But perhaps one of the most interesting cut features from the game is actually alternate costumes, as there actually were several icons located within the game's files that infer some kind of alternate costume feature for characters. Not only that, there were also a bunch of alternate costumes that were actually leaked via data miners. Some of them are unfinished, but a lot of them look pretty good. So hopefully at some point these get finished and added into the game officially. Checkered balls in Green Hill Zone, Sonic the Hedgehog. So these checkered boulder things that would have appeared in Green Hill Zone were shown in early screenshots of the game. And it was planned to serve a variety of functions, such as it would actually be an obstacle that would chase the player in certain sections of the level. And it was also planned to be used by Sonic to break through certain walls in the game. However, none of this ended up being implemented, and it can only be found via the debug mode. However, it did end up being restored in the 2013 remake. Test: Super Smash Bros. Melee. So this was just a simple test level found in the debug menu of Super Smash Bros. Melee. It's also sometimes known as the test stage, the coffee shop, the pub, and the bar. The reason it has all these nicknames is because the background of the level is a real-life picture, although it is very low quality and it's kind of hard to tell what it actually is. Although eventually it was actually found out that it was a real-life coffee shop located in Palo Alto, California. Besides this, the level just consists of some really basic gray polygons used as platforms. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Splatoon early content found in Super Mario Maker. So this is pretty much what it sounds like. So found within the files of Super Mario Maker through data mining. Various beta elements from Splatoon were found. You can find many pieces of gear, weapons, and even special weapons within these files. And it's pretty interesting, as some look extremely different from what they would end up looking like in the final version. ELH.SPZ, Luigi's Mansion. So this refers to an unused beta model from Luigi's Mansion, which never actually made it into the final game, although some speculate that this model might have once belonged to a boss fight that went unused in the final version. And after some digging around in the files, it was found out that this model was actually made 1 month after the E3 presentation. And the model surprisingly had 6 different animations attached to it, even though it was most likely lacking a texture, as this was probably not what it was intended to look like. 98 Robot, Undertale. So 98 Robot was one of the deleted and removed NPCs from the game, but surprisingly, he was almost fully developed. The dialogue that this character had is unknown, however it's said that he would have appeared in the Hotland region. Other than that though, not much else is known about this NPC. Although it has been theorized that the reason he was removed was because he didn't fit in with Metaton's presence. Unused Colossi, Shadow of the Colossus. It's been stated by the original creator of Shadow of the Colossus that there was originally going to be 48 Colossi, although that number was eventually cut down to just 24. However, that was only when they started working on the models. By the time the game was actually finished, there were only 16 Colossi found within the game. So in total, there are 10 cut Colossi that we have seen in art books. However, there are probably a lot more than that that were actually cut and never made it to the artwork phase. As through some data mining for the PS3 version of the game, it was found that there were many unknown Colossi names found within the PS3 sheets. Purple Rabbit, Super Mario 64 DS. Ah, Super Mario 64. I guess it doesn't really matter what version it is, there's always going to be some cut and lost content. This entry though simply refers to this image of a purple rabbit that's found on the manual of Super Mario 64 DS, as this rabbit doesn't actually appear anywhere in the game, and so it's led to many theories and conspiracies on how to obtain or unlock it. Although none of that has ever been found, and we don't actually know what the purpose of this purple rabbit really is. Early and unused Plants and Zombies. Plants vs. Zombies. So there's actually quite a few Plants and Zombies that never actually made it into the final game, and some of these are really interesting. So first, for plants, we had the Cherry Hover Bomb, which operated very similarly to the Cherry Bomb, so it's unsurprising this was left out. Then there was the Stinger, which was like a bee-like plant that could only shoot at flying enemies, although it could also be planted on top of other plants. Then there was Iceberg Lettuce, which was pretty much the same thing as the Cabbage Pult, although it would also slow enemies as well. There were also quite a few unused zombies, as well as some concept art of early zombies, such as an unused mother-type zombie, a dog zombie, and even a dog-walking zombie. Mr. Friendly. Half-Life. Now, there's a lot of creepy stuff in the Half-Life games. A lot of stuff that's actually in the games, and a lot of stuff that was cut. And this, I've got to say, is definitely one of the more disturbing ones I've come across. So this is Mr. Friendly, and contrary to his name, he is anything but friendly. He's actually one of the cut alien enemies from Half-Life. Now, its design is said to be that of a small horse, if you can even call it that. And the creature itself was meant to scavenge and shuffle around the map, eating the corpses of dead enemies. It was also said to attack the player, even being able to knock the weapon out of your hand. Now, all of that is pretty disturbing enough, right? Well, the backstory behind the creation of this thing is even more interesting, I think. So one of the developers at Valve, Ken Birdwell, was looking for concept art for enemies in Half-Life, and actually found an unlikely artist in his friend's 12-year-old brother. And so Birdwell asked his friend's brother to draw up some sketches of possible monsters. And yeah, I think you know where I'm going with this. This thing was designed by a 12-year-old. And not only that, Gabe Newell actually loved it. And so they did actually plan to put this in the game. There's even a model and everything. Now, there is one other glaring thing that I haven't really mentioned yet. I also don't think YouTube would really like it if I went into too much detail. But let's just say this creature had some sexual undertones, to say the least. Which probably had something to do with it being cut from the game. Isle Delfino on Globe, Super Mario Odyssey. So this refers to Isle Delfino being a part of the Super Mario Odyssey world at one stage in development before being cut at some point. As far as I could tell though, the only hint to this being true is that in one of the globe textures, Isle Delfino can actually be seen on the map. However, of course, it was never officially implemented into the game. Battle damage, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. So a really interesting planned but ultimately cut feature from Super Smash Bros. Brawl was battle damage, which would merely be a cosmetic difference to the character after sustaining an amount of damage during combat. And a couple of textures relating to this feature have been found in the game's files, showing the damaged versions of Captain Falcon, Meta Knight, Link, Marth, Ike, and Lucas. Unused character animations, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. So a couple of characters in the game had some unused and cut animations. Overall though, they're pretty basic stuff, such as an alternate landing for Captain Falcon, animations for a cut Kirby hammer attack, and even a cut animation for Fox and Falco's pistols misfiring. And there's a couple others, but they're pretty basic stuff. Dinosaur Planet. So before Star Fox Adventures was released in 2002, the game was first known as Dinosaur Planet. However, this game, Dinosaur Planet, that was being developed by Rare, was not actually initially a Star Fox game at all, and was instead a standalone title that was going to be released on the N64 rather than the Nintendo GameCube. However, Nintendo found that the game had a lot of similarities to the Star Fox series, and so I guess to avoid confusion or something, they just made it into a Star Fox game. However, interestingly enough, in February of 2021, the original Nintendo 64 version of Dinosaur Planet was found. It had been discovered by a video game preservation group called Forest of Illusion, who acquired a disc from a Swedish collector that contained a build of Dinosaur Planet dated December 1st, 2000, and the game has since been released online and is playable, although the ROMs are known to be pretty glitchy on emulators. Dragon King, the fighting game. So this game kind of has a similar case to Dinosaur Planet. What I mean by that is this was also an unfinished game, which was originally of course called Dragon King the Fighting Game. That was a low-budget 3D fighting game that was planned to be a series that would be developed for the Nintendo 64. However, it was eventually decided at one point that the game would use Nintendo's characters. Yeah, I think you all know where this is going. This game became the original Super Smash Bros. And we all know the game became incredibly popular after that, and the rest is history. However, all we have of the original Dragon King the Fighting Game are a couple of screenshots. But from what we can see, the game wasn't that far into development. There weren't even really characters or backgrounds, as they just used placeholders at the time. The Sonic the Hedgehog Band, Sonic the Hedgehog. So in a lot of the Sonic games, including the original game Sonic the Hedgehog, there's a feature called the sound test, which allows you to listen to sounds or music found within the game. However, one of the earlier ideas for the sound test was a little bit more complicated. It was called the Sonic the Hedgehog Band, and it would feature, of course, Sonic as well as many new characters. However, this concept, as well as many of the characters, ended up being cut due to time constraints. Robotnik was originally the main character. Oh boy, we're getting to the real juicy ones now. So this was kind of hard to find information on, but I'll tell you what I think this means. So in 1990, Sega wanted something to combat Nintendo's Mario franchise. They needed something as iconic that could not only serve as their mascot, but also be a game series to rival Mario. And the way they sought to do this was having a character design competition. And among them was, of course, Robotnik, although he wasn't known by that, or Eggman, or anything yet. However, this character did not win the contest, because as we all know, Sonic became the mascot of Sega. But funnily enough, Sonic and Robotnik were both designed by the same person, Naoto Oshima. During development of Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis, they liked Robotnik's design so much that they actually took that character and retooled him into the game's antagonist. And well, yeah, the rest is history. Sonic Surfing, Sonic the Hedgehog 3. So in Sonic the Hedgehog 3, there was an unused surfboard intro sequence where Sonic would surf his way onto Angel Island. And some of the sprites from this sequence still remain in the game and can be accessed via the debug mode. Blushing Chris, Deltarune Chapter 2. So this is a pretty simple and straightforward one. Found within the files of Deltarune Chapter 2, an unused sprite for Chris was found, showing the character both walk and stand while blushing. Similar sprites were also found for the character of Ralsei. Willy Wombat design by Butch Hartman, Crash Bandicoot. So before you had the titular character Crash Bandicoot, there was Willy Wombat, which was created all the way back in 1994. And one of the first artists that were brought on to design this new character of Willy Wombat was Butch Hartman, who you might recognize from his work on Fairly Odd Parents and Danny Phantom, for his unmistakable art style. And in a YouTube video, he even revealed some of the sketches that he made for this character. Although as we know, Willy Wombat ended up becoming Crash Bandicoot, so these were never used. Luigi and Sega GT prototype. Somehow Luigi just finds himself into the game files of literally everything. So in one of the prototype builds for Sega GT, a hidden secret race was found called Sony GT2. And within this race, holding the flag, was found none other than Mario's brother, Luigi. And it's thought that this was merely a joke done by the developers, as this prototype build was never meant to be released commercially at all. It's still really interesting though that this was found within the game, especially because, you know, Sega and Nintendo were basically sworn rivals back then. Naked Wario, WarioWare Inc., Mega Micro Games. Boy, that title. So this was a very strange find from WarioWare Inc., and it's just as the title suggests. And yeah, there were sprites found of a naked Wario. It's easy to see why this was cut from a kid's game, although I'm really just left here wondering why these were even made at all. But yeah, who knows what they were going for with this. Cult ending, Dream Daddy. So this is apparently a dad dating simulator, which was actually made by the Game Grumps. Yeah. Anyway, so one of the secret endings in the game is called the cult ending, otherwise known as Escape from Margarita Zone. However, it actually wasn't officially implemented into the game, although it did end up being found in an old version of the game. And so after it was found, it was eventually added back into the game as an Easter egg. The ending takes a pretty dark twist, and it's unlike any of the other endings in the game, but I'll let you experience that for yourself if you want to. Jester, Titanfall 2. So Jester was a character that was found in the first Titanfall game, and he was also planned to be included in the campaign of Titanfall 2. However, he was at some point cut from the campaign, although a figure of Jester for Titanfall 2 was still eventually released by McFarlane Toys. Original ending, Conker's Bad Fur Day. So apparently Conker's Bad Fur Day had an extremely dark cut ending. So dark, in fact, I'm gonna have to be careful with how I word this. But basically, as you know if you've played the game, it's essentially the opposite of a generic cutesy platformer type game that were really popular around that time. And so the developers at Rare took it upon themselves to really invert every type of trope. And they thought, what better way to end this game than one final... Basically what I'm trying to get at is by the end of the game, Conker would end himself, which he would do with a gun while looking at himself in the mirror. But to end this off on kind of a funnier note, it was said by one of the lead designers of the game, Chris Seavor, that the ending was cut because it didn't spot much for a sequel, rather than it just being extremely disturbing. Yeah, pretty wild. Cut enemies. Half-Life 2. So there are a ton of enemies that were cut from the Half-Life series, especially Half-Life 2, and I'll talk about a few of them here. So first there's the Combine Alien Assassin, which was found in the beta, as well as many of these other cut enemies. It was going to be an extremely swift enemy that could jump and attack the player very fast, and it's definitely got a really creepy design. However, the Combine Assassin was eventually reworked into what we now know is the Fast Zombie. There were also some cut enemies from the first game, which were planned to be included in the sequel, those being the Hound Eye and Bull Squid. There was also a worm-like creature called the Hydra, which was showcased in an E3 map, as well as a giant Combine guard boss. There was also the Cremator or Combine Janitor, as well as a Combine female assassin, which were also cut. Death of Gordon Freeman, Half-Life Decay. So in 2001, Valve released a multiplayer-only expansion pack to their ever-popular first-person shooter, Half-Life. It's made to be a co-op multiplayer experience, played by two people working together to pass the game's levels. The game only shipped with 9 missions, however, although it was originally planned to have 12 campaign missions. And in one of the planned missions, simply referred to as Mission 9, it was found that there would be a scene in which Gordon was captured by soldiers, and it would be up to the two players to save him from his execution. However, if the players failed to do so, Gordon would actually be killed, and there were even unused animations found to show this, as well as dialogue from the soldiers holding him. And using these animations and sounds as well as the map, a recreation has been made showing what the death of Gordon Freeman would have looked like in Half-Life Decay. Truly one of the most interesting pieces of cut content that I've ever seen in a Half-Life game. Atmosphere Pressure System, BioShock. So BioShock went through a ton of different developmental changes during its lifespan, with a lot of features being cut and a lot being added along the way. And one of these features that was planned for the game that was eventually removed was the atmospheric pressure system. It was a pretty complicated feature and would actually change a lot about the world, including the way plasmids, enemies, and weapons interacted, such as flames going farther under low pressure, things like that. However, this concept was eventually scrapped, as it would have been too hard to tell the differences in air pressure and know how the effects would play out inside the world. However, part of this mechanic was reused in Arcadia, and there's many pieces of artwork showcasing what these pressure systems would have looked like. And there were also many gene tonics that were planned to be associated with this mechanic that also had to be cut. Jeff Hardy, WWE SmackDown, Here Comes the Pain. So there's a lot of wrestlers that were removed from this game, including which was Jeff Hardy, who was removed from the game due to being released from WWE in April of 2003. His wrestler in the game was first shown though in July of 2003 in a reveal trailer, although despite appearing in multiple trailers, he was never actually included in the game. Freezatron, Little Big Planet. Inside the game's files, an unused gameplay tool called Freezatron or Ice Hazard was found, although it could only be acquired through hacking. However, the tool can't actually be used, as it was probably compiled for an earlier build of the game. Other than that though, there is some leftover language data that mentions the tool, saying, quote, "I thought I told you to freeze. Fire, ice, electricity, and gas." But that's pretty much it. Early enemies, Super Mario Galaxy. This game has a ton of unused content, and I know I say that a lot, but this game really does, including a lot of cut enemies. First, there was an early boss called the Boss Crab in the files, which would later become Mega Leg. There was a fake toad enemy called a Kinopi, a large piranha plant called the Octopus Queen, I guess? I mean, these are all internal names, so they're probably not what they were meant to be called in the game. There was also this weird thing, the Torimoti, and there's a lot more. So if you're interested, definitely check out the Cutting Room Floors page on Super Mario Galaxy. Samus's naked death animation, Super Metroid. Oh boy. So apparently in the original Japanese version of Super Metroid, it was planned that when Samus would die and it was a game over, that Samus would actually appear naked. Although of course for obvious reasons, this was never implemented in any version of the game. However, in one of the ROMs, there was an unused voice recording that was found, which one of the game's composers revealed was an unused death cry recording by Minako Himano. Although he said about the recording, quote, "We used the voice more carefully. When she dies, Himano did the voice, but it sounded too sexual, so we couldn't use it." As for proof of a naked Samus death animation, there really isn't any out there. At least that has been found anyway. Lives, Five Nights at Freddy's. In early versions of Five Nights at Freddy's, lives were actually going to be implemented into the game, where you could only die so many times before running out of lives, at which point you would then be set all the way back to night 1. Not only is there code that points to this being in the game, there are also text graphics which would have shown how many lives you had, which is still present within the game although it's not shown, and is automatically set to 3. Rayman originally had limbs. So this just refers to early character designs of Rayman, in which he of course had limbs. However, one of the most interesting things about his design choice of being limbless is that it wasn't necessarily an artistic choice. Rather, it came about due to technical limitations when making the original game. Although that did prove to be a blessing in disguise, as many people loved this design of a character. And yeah, it definitely left its mark. It's very different from every other mascot that was going around at the time, and has now since become the most iconic feature of the character. Although it would have been interesting to see what he would have looked like with his early design. Unused animal helpers, Donkey Kong Country. So the animal buddies, or animal helpers, are a very iconic feature of the Donkey Kong games. And there were some unused and cut ones in Donkey Kong Country, which was revealed by one of the game's developers, Greg Melees, on August 10th, 2018, when he revealed in a naming sheet for Donkey Kong Country a lot of differences. Most notably the name of the actual game, which would have been called Monkey Mayhem. But also on the sheet, 2 other animal buddies were found that were actually cut from the game. These being Hooter the Owl and Minnie the Mole. Hooter the Owl was probably cut for its similarities to the restaurant Hooters, for obvious reasons. But Minnie the Mole, I'm not sure why this guy was cut. Although maybe they'll return sometime in the future. Human mobs, Minecraft. So this is one of the more interesting Minecraft ones, I think. And surprisingly, it's kinda creepy. These so-called human mobs, which were known as monsters in the code, were actually hostile towards the player, and would appear with a default Steve-like skin. They were also said to spawn randomly throughout the world and would wander aimlessly, while flailing their arms and head around as they walked. I mean, just look at this animation. Imagine this thing chasing you down in your world. So yeah, I'm not really surprised these were cut, as they are just kind of confusing and weird. Left 4 Dead Original Survivors. So yeah, we all know the iconic Left 4 Dead survivors. You got Lewis, Bill, Francis, and Zoe, right? However, the original designs of our survivors were really different. Bill is pretty much the same, just has some different clothes. Francis, though, was incredibly different, having really long black hair as well as a beard. Lewis also looked very different, having short, curly black hair as well as a goatee. Zoe also had a very different outfit, having a pink hoodie as well as these strange pants and socks. Or whatever this is. All Bonds, GoldenEye 007. So due to some of the promotional material surrounding this game, as well as some images found within the game's files, it was thought that you could play as all 4 different Bonds in the game, each based on the different actors that played 007. Some thought that this was just something cut from the game, and others thought it was actually just a hoax, similar to something like L is Real. But just like L is real, the 3 bonds were actually found within the ROM of the game, including a portrait of the character as well as the textures that would accompany them. And in a recreation/mod of the game called GoldenEye X, all bonds were included in the multiplayer of the game. Although in the original GoldenEye 007 game, Pierce Brosnan is the only playable James Bond. Original endings. Twisted Metal. So there's a bunch of cut endings from Twisted Metal, which are known as the lost endings. A lot of them were cut due to quality concerns, as well as because of how cheesy and campy they were. The name of the game was also changed pretty late in development, and some of these endings were filmed before the name change, from High Octane to Twisted Metal. But now the lost endings are available on YouTube. 12 of them in fact, where they can still be watched today, although they are in very poor quality. Yellow Switch, Super Mario 64. So the yellow switch, or the yellow cap switch, is an unused object that was found in Super Mario 64. Now, like anything found in Super Mario 64, there's a bunch of theories as to what this would have been for. Some think it was somehow related to the Koopa shell, and the reason it was cut was because the level design didn't really have a use for it. The reason this switch is thought to be related to the Koopa shells at all is because due to decompiling the code related to Super Mario 64, it was found that the yellow cap switch, when activated, would give the player a Koopa shell. However, if you try to do this in-game by spawning one of these yellow cap switches, the switch is already pressed, meaning it doesn't actually do anything. So we're only left to wonder what it would really do, as some believe that the Koopa shell was actually just a placeholder for maybe a different item or a different mechanic entirely. Chain Lightning Gun. Quake. So this was a weapon that was originally planned to be in the full version of Quake. However, it was of course eventually cut. The way it was planned to work was when zapping another player with it, it would chain lightning to any other player that they see. Hence the name Chain Lightning Gun. However, the only things we have to go on relating to its existence are the README file which promised its existence within the game, as well as a HUD icon. But the Chain Lightning Gun was eventually retooled into Quake Mission Pack 2, Dissolution of Eternity as the Plasma Gun. Original story, Destiny. So the creation of Destiny was pretty messy to say the least, especially when it came to the story. The reason for this is one of the lead developers of the story, who's a veteran at Bungie, Joe Staten, presented what he called a supercut, showing the game's cinematics and major story beats within a video. But apparently the senior staff at Bungie didn't really like how the story panned out, and so they had to scrap that completely and start from scratch, devising an entirely new plot and story only a year before the game would release in 2014. And it's a shame because a lot of people didn't like the story that Destiny shipped with at all. So who knows, maybe this lost and cut story was better than what we actually got. I mean, it probably was. But I guess we'll never truly know. Brick Pyramid, Minecraft. So apparently way back in the early days of Minecraft, there was a feature in which in your world, somewhere a huge pyramid structure made up of bricks would spawn. And this would actually at this point in the game be the only way to acquire bricks in survival mode. Strangely though, regardless of seed, the brick pyramids would always spawn in the same place in every world, relative to your spawn point. What I mean is, if you created a world and walked forward exactly 501 blocks and then turned left and continued for a couple hundred more blocks, you would always encounter a brick pyramid. And these things were huge, being made up of 43,680 brick blocks. Not surprisingly, this was removed pretty quickly in development. And as to why this even existed in the first place, some think it was merely used to test structure generation in worlds. But who knows. Sky Chase Dragon, Sonic Adventure. So the Sky Chase Dragon was an interesting cut entity that would appear in Sky Chase Act 2, and was featured in development screenshots of the game. However, it's of course missing from the final game, and it's not really known what it would have done or how it would have interacted in the game, although it was once again found in the files of Sonic Adventure DX. E3 Knuckles voice, Sonic Adventure. So as shown in the E3 1999 demo of Sonic Adventure, Knuckles had a very different voice. Although it was actually the same voice actor, they had just redone most of his lines, as the E3 version of Knuckles portrayed a very different character. giving a completely different vibe from what you'll find in Sonic Adventure. Terios, Sonic Adventure 2. So before you had the iconic edgelord Shadow the Hedgehog, he was first originally conceived as Terios, or Terios, I don't really know. The name apparently derives from a Japanese verb that means to compare. Although that name was eventually scrapped and we were left with the much simpler and better sounding Shadow the Hedgehog. However, the various Sonic communities have taken it upon themselves to give this character a completely new life of its own, sporting an entirely different look and design when compared to the original Shadow the Hedgehog. Nails, Sonic Adventure 2. So this is essentially the same thing that happened with Shadow and Terios. This character Nails was the original version of Rogue the Bat. Hey, yeah, it's actually, Rouge. I'm stupid. Carrying on. However, as we know, the name didn't stick very long. And like Terios and Shadow, there is no concept art showing this different version of Rogue. So as of now, it's merely a name change. Inherit the Nightmare Last Form, Bloodborne. So this is an incredibly interesting, albeit disturbing, unused boss found in Bloodborne. The boss can't actually be accessed through normal gameplay, as it was cut from the final release of the game. However, through data mining, many unused assets were found related to this boss. And the boss itself can even actually be fought in-game, although it's obviously not completed. It's thought though that this boss is most likely just a version of the Moon Presence boss, which is one of the final optional bosses in the game. But yeah, this thing is pretty grotesque and disturbing, even for Bloodborne standards. The entirety of the Angry Birds Tennis beta. So the beta version of Angry Birds Tennis is incredibly different from the final version that was eventually released. But altogether, the game is kind of a rough history. I mean, it was only released in North America and Mexico in February of 2020, only to be later discontinued on September 11th of 2020. And the only official way to download the game is to be in Zimbabwe, and even then the game won't load when downloaded. And as for the beta content, well, as the title of this entry suggests, the beta is completely lost. But it's said that it would have looked very different from the final version that we got, including different game modes, unique songs for characters, and different character bios, as well as many other changes that we might not ever know about unless a beta version of the game is ever found. Starbean's cameos, Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga. In the game Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, there exists a shop called the Starbeans Cafe, located in Bean Bean Castle Town, which lets you create 7 different types of bean juices, utilizing various beans you can come across throughout the game. And all the different flavors give a unique stat boost, and once they are made for the first time, a cutscene will play featuring the character Egad. However, it was originally planned that each drink would have a cutscene featuring a different popular Nintendo character. Those were Wario, Fox, Link, Olimar, Samus, and even Excite Bike Racer. Not only was the actual text from what each character would say in the cutscene found, but also many of the sprites of the characters as they would have appeared in said cutscenes. And it's thought that these were all cut to further expand the role of Egad in the game. James Bond and other cut characters, Smash 64. For the original Super Smash Bros., also known as Smash 64 for the Nintendo 64, there were a total of 12 playable characters when the game released. However, many fans of these franchises felt that others should have been included, or that some originally were even meant to be in the game but were cut for one reason or another, such as King Dedede and Bowser, who were cut from the game pretty late into development. There were also planned characters that never made it in, such as Mewtwo, and it's even been stated that James Bond, portrayed by Pierce Brosnan in GoldenEye 64, was once considered for the roster, although this was most likely cut very early on in development. Biolante from Godzilla Save the Earth. For Godzilla Save the Earth, a 3D fighter being released for the Xbox and PS2, there was a fan-favorite Godzilla character which was revealed as being playable in the game before its release, that being Biolante. Although sadly, not long after, the character was scrapped in August of 2004, due to the character not being submitted in time for approval to Toho. And so, she was abandoned very late into development, only months before the game would release, But the character was found, and in a mostly playable and complete state thanks to modder Dylan Rocket, and can actually be played using emulators and mods. Jimmy Hopkins' old voice actor, Bully. In the beta version of Bully, the main and playable character of the game, Jimmy Hopkins, was actually voiced by a different voice actor than what's heard in the final release. Instead of Jerry Rosenthal's performance, Jimmy is voiced by someone else. Who that is, well, we don't know for sure, but it's thought that it might have been Daniel Zaitchik, who did most of the motion capture for Jimmy's character model. Anyway, there isn't much at all, but have a listen.
Alright, I guess I better get changed.
Cut DLC characters, PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. Before the support for PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale ended, there was a ton of DLC characters that were being developed for the game. However, at some point, Superbot Entertainment, the company that was working on the game, ceased working on DLC. And shortly after, the company became defunct. And subsequently, none of these DLC characters that were planned and worked on were released. 4 of the characters that were confirmed to be in development were Dartfeld from The Legend of Dragoon, Abe from Oddworld, Ryu Hayabusa from Ninja Gaiden, and Tomba from, well, Tomba. Apparently though, a bunch of other characters were considered for DLC, but were never actually worked on, such as Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, Lara Croft, Sub-Zero, and many others. Mother 3 Unused Final Boss. The cut and unused final boss of Mother 3 has been the subject of a lot of debate and speculation over the years within the community. This is because some of the battle backgrounds from this cut boss can actually be accessed in the game by using cheat codes within emulators such as Visual Boy Advance. And once the code is activated and a player encounters an enemy, these unused battle screens can be seen, and they are pretty disturbing. This boss battle takes on various different forms of characters and enemies, all with different screens, such as the straw form, vapor forms, elevator form, rope snake form, and more. Makes you think of how creepy the final boss of this game could have been. Pikachu in Conker's Bad Fur Day. As revealed in an early version of Conker's Bad Fur Day, Pikachu was actually planned to make a cameo within the game, and had a scene before it was eventually cut from the final release. The scene was eventually restored and showed what it would have looked like, although it was missing some animations. And funnily enough, it isn't really that inappropriate at all. Just a small cameo appearance showing his tail. That's it really, however I guess just the idea of one of Nintendo's most popular characters being associated with a rated M game just didn't go over so well, and it was subsequently cut. Samus and Link in Marvel Ultimate Alliance. Back when the game Marvel Ultimate Alliance was in development, it was revealed through short gameplay footage that Link and Samus were going to be included as bonus characters, which even showed off their various moves and animations, meaning they were pretty far into development of not only the game, but these characters. I guess they just weren't really too keen on them being put in this game for some reason. But then my question just becomes, why even make them before you have the go-ahead? Or did Nintendo just cancel last minute? Who knows? Although they would have been one of the more interesting inclusions if they had been added. Mike, Five Nights at Freddy's 2. This is one with not a lot of information on it, but that might just make it all the more creepy really. Basically, in the files of FNAF 2, there was a graphic found within the game's files. A very small image of a crying skull titled simply Mike. Although this was never actually used anywhere in the game, so far as we know, and fans have only been left to speculate on what this could have meant, such as if it relates at all to the characters of Mike Schmidt or Michael Afton, although there's never really been an answer as to what this is or why it was never used. The Smasher and the Teacher, Dead by Daylight. The Smasher and the Teacher are 2 unused killers from the early development stages of Dead by Daylight. The Smasher was meant to be able to destroy obstacles on the level, such as trees and walls, although he was eventually cut as it would have been hard to balance a character that could actually remove elements of a stage at any given time. As for the Teacher, well, this was either just an unused or potentially a test killer, or maybe just even a joke by the developers. It was first discovered when in July of 2016, 3 files relating to the Teacher were discovered. those being icons for a new survivor item called Trapple, a killer power called Detention, and a killer perk called Underperform. This was all thought to be for a teacher-like killer, as the developers had announced that their first DLC character would come out in August of 2016. However, the new killer that came out was the nurse, and the supposed teacher killer was never released, and the files seemingly related to this unused killer were never used. ImperfectCookie.png, Cookie Clicker. Within the files of the Cookie Clicker game, there was found a pretty creepy image called ImperfectCookie.png, which is essentially just a big cookie with someone's face on it, which may have been from a cut feature or was maybe intended to be a part of an Easter egg. There is also some unused code attached to this image, which when executed will overlay the cookie in-game. But that's about it. Dungeons, Cookie Clicker. One of the early features that was cut from Cookie Clicker were the dungeons, which were featured in some of the very early builds, although they could only be accessed through the browser console. Although when the game was officially released, the functionality of dungeons were removed, and although the developers said at some point they would return in some sort of an update, they never actually did. Although they were meant to operate as a roguelike game where you must search rooms, break crates, and fight bosses to collect cookies and loot. And there are a ton of unused files related to this feature, as it was a pretty big part of the game to be cut out. There's chest graphics, doors, map icons, and enemies, not to mention a bunch of code which showed how these systems would have actually worked in-game. Thor the Inventor, A Hat in Time. Thor was a cut character and inventor that would have been found in the game A Hat in Time. However, he does appear in the game, although not in the way he was originally intended to be, as he can be seen as one of the frozen victims inside of Queen Vanessa's manor, although he was actually planned to play a much bigger role, as he would have helped Hat Kid get to Mafia HQ as well as upgrade her weapons. He also had a unique hat called Thor's Cap that was also cut from the game, that would give the player the ability to attack while in the air. However, Thor as well as his cap were removed from the game before its full release. Tim the Time Lord, A Hat in Time. Tim is another character who was going to play a fairly big role in the game before being cut entirely. He was actually planned to be a kind of teacher role and teach the player and Hat Kid, presumably about how the game works, along with its various mechanics. However, as the game shifted to be more platforming based, there wasn't really a need for a character like this, and so he was cut. Although just like Thor and some other cut characters, he also appears in Queen Vanessa's manor. Mizzo, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. This was a removed enemy found in the adventure mode Subspace Emissary in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Although in the final version of the game, the Mizzo only appears in the display room of the Battleship Halberd exterior. It's thought that the enemy itself would have been water-based due to its name being similar to the Japanese word for water, which is Mizu. And there were also some animations that were found in the files, although most of them don't work properly. Rosalina's early design, Super Mario Galaxy. This is a pretty simple one, but basically Super Mario Galaxy is the first game that Rosalina appears in. And so as she was a new character, she probably went through many redesigns before they settled on their final design for the game. Although one of the early concept arts has been found, and it's very different from her final look in Super Mario Galaxy. Yeah, I definitely think the final design is better, but what do you guys think? The Blob, Doom. Yes, going all the way back to the original Doom, basically the birthplace of FPS games. Now, the Blob, as he is called, is a planned but deleted monster from the classic Doom, which was revealed from a sprite showing a red skull which would later appear and be used for the mouth of the Pain Elemental in Doom 2. Naughty JPEGs. Naughty JPEGs. SpongeBob SquarePants Super Sponge. Now, as I've been going through all of these for this video series, we've seen some weird stuff, right? But this, I think, so far definitely takes the cake. So in the PlayStation 1 SpongeBob game, Super Sponge, released in 2001, quite a few unused and cut assets were found within the game's files, and among them were these 3 images. Yes, they were actually found in an official SpongeBob video game, and are labeled naughty1, 2, and 3.jpg. Why these were even included within the archives and development discs, or even made to begin with, is unknown. But there are a bunch of weird stuff found within this game, so maybe that's another story for another time. Toxic Meter, Five Nights at Freddy's 2. This was a simple cut feature from FNAF 2 that would have acted as a way to restrict how long the player could use the mask in the game, as when you put it on, the toxic meter would rise and eventually flash red until if you had the mask on too long, you would presumably die, or get jump scared or something. Although the mechanic was never fully implemented, and all we have from the files is this graphic of the actual meter, and it's thought that this was planned as a way to balance the mask instead of having to have Foxy be able to attack you while wearing it. Steve Ballmer mooning the camera, Halo 2. Now this cut file has a lot of history behind it, even apparently causing Microsoft to lose around $500,000 because they had to have this game re-rated by the ESRB thanks to partial nudity. But I'm kinda getting ahead of myself, so what really is this? Well, basically in the Windows Vista PC version of Halo 2, there was an error that could occur called the .ass error, which would display an image of one of the lead designers mooning Steve Ballmer, who was visiting the Bungie offices during the development of Halo 2. And as a joke, this image made it into the software. And yeah, I think this is kind of mislabeled because it isn't actually Steve Ballmer mooning the camera, he was the one getting mooned, but yeah. Anyway, it was never meant to be accessible by the public, and in a kind of long story with numerous meetings with Microsoft and the ESRB, who are obviously responsible for rating the games, it was decided that further releases had to be delayed to apply new stickers on the cases that included nudity on the label, which was stated to have cost Microsoft around $500,000 for this. Whoops. Monocle Boss, Silent Hill Downpour. So one of the monsters featured in Silent Hill Downpour is the so-called Monocle Man, who appears in only one encounter in the actual game, despite being featured more prominently in early trailers for the game, including what may be a potential boss fight with the character, which can be seen in one of the trailers. Although not much else is known about this, and it's unknown why or when it was cut in development. Tsar Dragon, Final Fantasy VI. There are quite a few unused enemies in Final Fantasy VI, but arguably the most well-known one is the Tsar Dragon, who appeared as an incomplete monster in the game, that includes a sprite and even attacks, although there is no battle script. And besides some basic dialogue that was found from a potential boss fight, not much else is known, although it's speculated that the dragon was intended to be an optional endgame boss. And that was actually kind of fulfilled in the Kaiser Dragon, who was added to the Game Boy Advance port and was given a unique battle script and a different sprite. Fukuda Battle Rifle, Titanfall 2. This was a cut primary weapon that was first showcased in a book, The Art of Titanfall 2, which showed quite a few number of ideas and concept arts that never made it into the actual game. This gun, however, the Fukuda Battle Rifle, was a pretty basic rifle type of design. And not much else is known about it other than the fact that it was probably named after the game's director, Steve Fukuda. Cut Executions, Manhunt 2. Oh boy, so there's a lot to go into here, and I'll do my best to explain it without showing anything too graphic, because believe me, some of these are really graphic and disturbing, and yes, I am already working on a cut and lost content video for the Manhunt games. So I will cover this in a lot more detail in that video, including showing the uncensored executions, but if you want to see them, feel free to look them up. There's a couple of videos showcasing them on YouTube. But yeah, be warned, they are pretty violent. Anyway, so there are a ton of cut environmental executions in the game, so here's the list. Yeah, it's quite a bit. Although the vending machine and dumpster executions are the only ones that have been fully restored. The rest were most likely planned and unfinished, as they don't appear anywhere in the actual game. Then there were also multiple weapons that didn't appear in the game that also had cut executions. And yeah, there are a ton. Although some of the animations of these executions for some of these items have been recovered and been restored, such as surprisingly the newspaper. Yeah, pretty interesting. And there's a lot more to this all, so stay tuned for that Manhunt video. Distrust, Danganronpa prototype. Yeah, this was a precursor and prototype of what would become the iconic visual novel Danganronpa, and it was first known as Distrust. And of course there were many other differences as well before it was eventually scrapped and just changed into Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc. Because it was thought that Distrust was too gruesome, even for being a murder mystery visual novel. Besides that, it's also known that many of the characters were slightly different in design, having different names as well, including the protagonist Makoto Naegi, who was first known simply as Shujinko, which translates to just protagonist in Japanese. There was also apparently an early version of the influence gauge, which was a trust and distrust meter. And also this meter, which would show how the various students felt about the protagonist, was planned to have a huge impact on the game, even determining the murders that would take place, as well as different branching story paths and even alternate endings. There were also more violent executions, including one that was actually found, although I don't want to spoil who it is if you haven't played the game, because there is a very similar death in Danganronpa. But yeah, feel free to check it out if you're interested. Monokuma's original design, Danganronpa. So, you know this guy? Well, if you're not familiar with the Danganronpa games, this cute bear, Monokuma, is kind of the mascot of these games. And you might find it surprising, just like I did, that this was his original design. Yeah, pretty disturbing, and yeah, it does serve kind of the same purpose, being two different halves, I guess. But yeah, it's really no surprise that they changed to this more cute and unassuming design. I definitely don't think Monokuma would be as loved if he looked like this. Meta Kraid, Metroid Prime. Also known as just Kraid, this is an iconic alien enemy appearing in many games in the Metroid series. But in Metroid Prime he never actually appears, despite him being featured in advertisements, Nintendo Power, and even in the game's manual. So what happened? Why isn't he in the game? Well, he was definitely planned to be in it. There's a bunch of concept art, not to mention actual in-game models, and in the level he was meant to appear in as a boss fight, development was behind schedule, and instead of running the risk of having to push back the release date of the game, the devs decided to finish the level without actually adding in the Meta Kraid boss fight, and so he was cut just like that from the game. Although it was revealed by one of the artists that designed Meta Kraid for Metroid Prime that this helmet he's wearing in the concept art would be something involved in the boss fight, as you would have to make objects fall on top of his metal helmet in order to defeat him. Thinner Mickey, Epic Mickey. This was a cut concept that was planned to be introduced in Epic Mickey, in which there would be a form of Mickey that he would turn into if he had used too much thinner or destroyed too many enemies using thinner. This form was called Thinner Mickey, and yeah, it's pretty creepy. Showing Mickey's paint melt off his body, looking like something out of like a creepypasta or something. Yeah, not really surprised this was cut, but hey, it's cool concept art nonetheless. Fun Girl, Yandere Simulator. So this was a mysterious character found within the files of Yandere Simulator during two different builds of the game. However, this character was never fully implemented. However, there are various images of her that can be found in the files, such as in a weird Easter egg where you can see different images based on what number is entered in a file called fun.txt, showing a picture of Fun Girl along with a response depending on a certain number, with a pretty disturbing one if you input 666. There are also more responses complete with unique art which can be seen when editing the JSON file. Anyway, there's actually even more stuff you can do with this, with unique responses to certain numbers, and even adding characters in the game using the JSON file, which will actually spawn in the Fun Girl model into the game. And I'm guessing this is all just some sort of Easter egg and something for data miners to find, as she never actually really makes an appearance in the game besides with this, and the developer actually tries to pretend that he doesn't know what people are talking about when they bring up Fun Girl, to I guess keep the secrets and mystery going or something, but yeah. Evil Coco, Crash Twinsanity. An evil version of the character Coco was planned to be included in the game as a villain, although she was removed at some point during development, and besides the fact that she is probably the sister of Evil Crash, not much else is known. And she is only seen in one of the deleted scenes from Crash Twinsanity, where her design is shown and she meets Crash and other characters at the 10th dimension. And in the scene, she is shown to be the opposite of her usual character's personality. Stormcloak and Imperial War, Skyrim. So if you've played Skyrim, you probably remember this. At least maybe a little bit of it. I mean, they kind of make it a big deal in the opening cutscene, but as you go on, the main conflict of Skyrim kind of just fizzles out. And there's not too much really to the Stormcloak and Imperial conflict, as the story went on to more so focus on the dragons and, well, the dragonborn aspect of the story, fleshing out more of its fantasy elements, with the Civil War story kind of becoming more of a side plot that was heavily cut down by the time Skyrim was released. Sure, there are a couple of missions for each side, and you can choose which side to fight for, but it was planned to be much more dynamic and larger in scale, and some of these cut elements have been found within the files, such as many pieces of cut dialogue which suggest additional missions, as well as just remnants of missions that were going to be used. And apparently there were actually going to be 12 Civil War quests for this storyline, when in reality only 3 of them were used in the final game. There were also going to be payments for various missions, and even city sieges which could take place at various towns and holds throughout the game. There's a ton to look into on this, but let's just say the Civil War we got was extremely cut down compared to what they had planned. Unused vehicles, Star Wars Jedi Knight, Jedi Academy. Not only are there unused areas and weapons, but there are a ton of vehicles that were found in Jedi Knight, Jedi Academy, all which can be accessed by using NPC vehicle commands, those being the Z95 Headhunter, the X-Wing, TIE Fighter, TIE Bomber 2, which is I guess an alternative version, Lambda class Imperial Shuttle, and the Rancor. Yeah, quite a lot, and they work as well, which is pretty interesting. So why'd these get cut? Well, your guess is as good as mine. Cut biomes, Minecraft. So if you've played Minecraft, which, let's be real, who hasn't, you know about the standard ones. You've got your beaches, your forests, deserts, tundra, all that stuff. But there was also some biomes that were planned for future updates that were never integrated, and had to be cut for one reason or another. Like, for example, the Mountain Edge sub-biome, similar to the Jungle Edge biome, which would generate at the top and edges of mountains. Another example is the Deep Warm Ocean, which is similar to the Warm Ocean biomes. However, these sub-biomes would be much deeper. Clown Heist, GTA 5. Also known as the Sharmuta Job or the Nice House Heist, this is a cut heist that would have been featured in GTA 5 as a main story mission, which would involve Michael and Trevor robbing the mansion of the character Martine Madrazo. And within the file missions.xml, a lot about this mission was found, including some of the planning phases and objectives of the mission, which would have had Michael and Trevor book an appointment and visit the house as potential buyers, which would act as the prep for the heist, before actually raiding the house. And there were also various approaches that were going to be planned for this, just like the other heists in the game, such as a way where it could be done stealthily at night, or alternatively, Michael and Trevor could dress up as clowns and arrive at a part of the house, entertain the guests, and gain access to the stables in order to steal Martine Madrazo's horse, which was one of the objectives, before actually stealing his safe and then his wife, Patricia. And you know, if you've played the game, that Patricia does get kidnapped by Trevor, although that does happen in a different mission, as this heist was scrapped, and most likely pretty early in development too. Although they did apparently like that story beat of Trevor kidnapping Martine's wife for some reason. And interestingly, the Cayo Perico heist, released recently in GTA Online, features a lot of cut content from the Sharmuta heist, such as various characters like Patricia Madrazo, as well as an estate agent named Jackie, who was actually going to help plan the original heist in the story mode. Buster Sword, Final Fantasy X. This is just a pretty quick one, but in the game, Titus actually has the Buster Sword as a weapon, the same one from Final Fantasy XII. Yeah, I meant Final Fantasy VII, my bad. But it cannot be accessed through normal means, and was probably planned to be in the actual game, but was never actually introduced. However, it can be hacked into the game using a save editor, which then makes the weapon completely usable in-game. Jimmy Hopkins could die in acid. Bully. Yes, you heard that right. It sounds like some sort of rumor that you hear all the time in Rockstar games. Like, you know, Bigfoot, Leatherface, ghosts, all of that, but none of it's really, well, real, right? Well, it turns out this scene actually was real, although it was cut from the game. The scene itself only occurred during the mission Showdown at the Plant, which is one of the later missions, where the protagonist Jimmy must face off against the leader of the townie clique, Edgar, at the power plant. And apparently at one early stage of development, if Jimmy were to lose this fight, Jimmy would actually die after being thrown into a vat of acid. Yeah, not really something in tone with the rest of the game. Sure, if this was GTA, nobody would bat an eye, but this game is actually rated T. And there was allegedly a cutscene and everything, although that hasn't been fully pieced together as a lot of this scene and its assets were removed from the game entirely. Although it's pretty clear that this is actually real, as there are still sound clips of Edgar during this scene, as well as some code that also backs up this idea. And yeah, I mean, if it was any other company, you'd probably be very surprised, but Rockstar, yeah, you know how they are. Oilman original design, Mega Man powered up. Now, I'll be honest here, I'm not really too sure on this one, but I think this refers to the concept art of Oilman, which is slightly different from what his finalized design looks like. Yeah, nothing too crazy, but there are some differences. Unused endings, Skullgirls. So in Skullgirls, found within the files were a bunch of cut endings from the game which went unused, as these additional endings could not be finished and fully implemented into the story with the amount of people working on the game at Revenge Labs. And so they were all cut. Of all the characters though, Double, Big Band, Squiggly, and Fukua all only had one ending, although Cerebella, Philia, Misfortune, Painwheel, Parasol, Peacock, and Valentine all had cut endings, and the script text of these scenes has been found and can be read online. Although I won't spoil any of them if you haven't played the game, but go check it out if you're interested. Human Pilot, Star Fox 2. Due to another big source code leak at Nintendo, a lot of cool and interesting stuff was found from their properties and games. And among them is a pretty crazy discovery that was found in Star Fox 2, where alongside the other animal-themed pilots in the game, an actual human pilot was found. Which is very interesting, because as far as I know, there aren't any humans in the Star Fox series. And another thing that's interesting is when shown this, one of the game's lead designers, Dylan Cuthbert, said on Twitter, quote, "I don't even remember, as this is all very early on prototype stuff. We switch around a ton of stuff." So maybe it was just an early prototype of a character, but who really knows? Nightmare Apostle, mini-boss with human face. So the Nightmare Apostles are enemies encountered throughout Bloodborne, which are basically just giant spiders, but even more disturbing are these Nightmare Apostles, with human heads found in the Chalice dungeons, similar to Patches the Spider. But also, apparently there was a Nightmare Apostle mini-boss which also had a human face. Not to be confused with the large Nightmare Apostle, I guess, which is just a larger version, although this one lacks the disturbing human face. Bomb Bomb and Bubbles Retexture, Angry Birds Trilogy. In the Angry Birds Trilogy released on the Xbox 360 and PS3, there are some sprites that went unused in the game, which were actually early designs and textures for two birds in the game, those being Bubbles and Bomb Bomb. Now, Bubbles is in the final game. However, he sports a very different design from the one that was found, as this early sprite was a larger one with green polka dots on it, as well as different expressions. And for Bomb Bomb, well, this bird never actually made it to the final version of the game, although his sprite was also found, and he also appears in a concept art. Ending X, Dead Rising 3. In Dead Rising 3, there are multiple endings that you can get, 5 in total in the official game. But there is also a 6th unused and cut ending called Ending X, which is pretty brutal and disturbing, and shows the main character of the game, Nick, being killed by the survivors. And it's thought that this ending would have come about if Nick killed a certain amount of survivors, or even all the ones that you can, although it's not known for sure. But the video of this ending has been found and has been uploaded to YouTube where it can be watched. Mario model in Pikmin. This is a very simple one, just the model of Mario that was found in Pikmin. But I guess this was one of the most detailed Mario models to date, and he even has some visible creases on his outfit, as well as a light brown mustache instead of a dark or even black one. Final smashes in Smash 64. This is really interesting, and I definitely didn't know about this before, but yes, apparently Final Smashes were already planned, and were going to be included in Smash 64, the first outing in the franchise. Although of course they weren't really introduced until Smash Bros. Brawl. But there are some sounds that were left over which show they were going to be used in the first Smash Bros., which can be played via the debug menu. Those Final Smash audios are for the characters of Kirby, Fox, Pikachu, Captain Falcon, and Ness. The entirety of Time Splitters 2 is inside of Homefront: The Revolution. Okay, now this is pretty strange, but yeah, I've never heard of anything like this being in a game before. Let me know if you've ever heard of anything like this, cause I'm pretty curious, but basically the entire game of Time Splitters 2 can be played inside of Homefront: The Revolution, through an arcade machine in the game. Although this would only have the first 2 levels, and it wasn't until a secret code was figured out that the entire game could be played, including story, arcade, and challenge modes. So yeah, this isn't really so much cut or unused content, as it is just like a big Easter egg, which was lost for a while, sure, but it was eventually found, and it can still be played today. And it's also the only way to officially play Time Splitters 2 on PC, so yeah. Bloody Stitched Face. Race with Ryan. Alright, we are definitely getting into the more interesting and weird stuff here at level 6. So this concerns a little racing game from 2019 called Race with Ryan, which is based on the Ryan's World channel on YouTube. And yeah, it's kind of a basic racing Mario Kart type of game. Looks innocent enough, right? Well, take a look at this texture which was found in the game. Yeah. So there's a bloody stitched face of Ryan. Why this was made or why it was in the files is still a mystery. Obviously it wasn't supposed to appear in the game, but why even make this? Was it just supposed to be some kind of morbid joke? I mean, this is supposed to be the texture of Ryan, who is a real-life kid that this is based on. I don't know, it's just kinda creepy. Genocide City Zone, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. In one of the many prototypes of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, known as the Simon Y prototype, there was a level which was of course not in the official release of the game, called Genocide City Zone, which was eventually changed to the name Cyber City, and was designed as a mechanical themed area, although before it was finished it was scrapped. However, some of the assets from the level did end up getting used, as well as some of the level design itself, which was used for Metropolis Act 3. Boo Key, Super Mario 64. So the Boo Keys, which is also known as the Big Boo Keys, are unused key-like objects that were going to be obtainable after defeating Big Boo enemies, as shown in early trailers of the game. The key itself has 4 different variants, those being a default yellow key, as well as a red, green, and blue one. Also in the Japanese version of the game, there is an unused texture for the HUD, which would have most likely displayed the amount of keys you had, but of course this wasn't actually used in the game, and isn't even present in some versions of Super Mario 64. As to the purpose of the keys, well, that's just up to speculation, although the keys can still be viewed in the game using codes. Canon Bowsette, Super Mario Odyssey. Yeah, that's right. Apparently in Super Mario Odyssey, Bowsette was almost actually a thing. At least according to some concept art from the game. And yeah, this art that was shown in an official art book for Super Mario Odyssey predates the meme. So Nintendo was already on top of that, I guess. And honestly, they probably could have made so much money on merch and stuff if they actually did this. But who knows, maybe someday they'll actually introduce a canon Bowsette. Master Ball, Pokemon Go. Now, I don't think this is exactly surprising that this wasn't used, given the monetized nature of Pokemon Go. I mean, a Pokeball that is guaranteed to work might just break this game. Either way, it was almost put into the game, at least at some stage, as not only are there full textures of the Master Ball which were found, but also the ball could be hacked into the game, and actually be used, and of course it catches Pokemon 100% of the time, just like it does in the other games. Maybe they will find a way to balance it and reintroduce it into the game, but as of now, I don't really see how it could work. Memos, Mother 3. In Mother 3, there is an inaccessible and removed feature called the Memo menu. This menu would have elaborated and gave descriptions of various things in the game, such as the game's mechanics, pieces of story, lore about characters and locations, and more. And as the player would progress through the game, more information would become available in the memo, explaining the various things that you would encounter. Although at some point in development, this feature ended up being cut. However, the menu is still usable via the debug room, where a lot of these memos can still be read. Kirby GCN models used in Super Smash Bros. Brawl and Return to Dreamland. So Kirby GCN is a term used to describe all three or any one of the three cancelled Kirby games that were being made for the Nintendo GameCube. Although it's thought that a lot of the material that was going to be used in these games ended up making it into other Kirby titles and even other Nintendo games in some fashion, such as with Kirby's Return to Dreamland, which was a successor to Kirby GCN. However, this entry in the Iceberg refers to certain models which were going to be used in Kirby GCN that made it into other games, like Return to Dreamland, but also Super Smash Bros. Brawl, which I guess refers to Kirby's model, but I'm not too sure on this one. Digimon Rumble Arena 2 Early Build. Found inside the original release of Digimon Rumble Arena 2 is a prototype version of the game dated March 5th, 2003, over a year before the game would actually release. And there are quite a few differences to be found between the two versions, such as the title and character select screens being very different. There were also some characters in the prototype that can be seen in the roster which ended up being cut in the final release, and only 4 of the characters in the prototype were actually playable, and 2 of those characters didn't even make it to the release, those being Hawkmon and Armadillomon. There was also a debug menu which could be accessed in the prototype, as well as some unused assets such as these arena screens. Robo SpongeBob Muscle Pants, Battle for Bikini Bottom. Another pretty big piece of cut content from Battle for Bikini Bottom. This is an unused version of the final boss of the game, featuring a Robo SpongeBob with muscular arms, just like he had in the episode of the series Muscle Bob Buff Pants. The episode itself can actually be played, although in a very glitchy state with a bunch of crashes and such. But it is only accessible in the GameCube and Xbox versions. Like I said, the boss is glitchy and unfinished. He has 2 attacks, but they do no damage to the player. Likewise, you cannot do damage to the boss either. Also, interesting to note, you play as Patrick in this section, unlike the regular version of the final boss where you play as SpongeBob. And these files for this cut fight are also present in the remaster or remake of this game. Smiley face, Super Mario Bros. 2. A very basic one, but notable because it's actually the logo of the cutting room floor. But it's just simply a smiley face texture which was found hidden within the files of SMB2, and was found in one of the desert stages. And so it's thought that this is just a placeholder texture that they forgot to remove. The Stable, Undertale. One of the many unused assets found in the game is this stable, which is pretty crudely drawn compared to a lot of the other sprites in the game. There was also some code related to this sprite that was found, such as some unused dialogue that is presented as this. But that's pretty much all we know about this. Unused monsters, Silent Hill. In the original Silent Hill, there are many interesting and weird conceptual and planned monsters that were removed or just never made it into the final game. Those being the butterfly monster, the chicken? Yes, definitely looks like a chicken to me. The L, which I guess is a stingray type of creature. The frog, which is pretty creepy. The MKY, which may or may not be a monkey or something. The ostrich, and finally the snake, which looks more like a rat or something, but hey, it was 1999. Besides their existence and models which were found, not much else is known about them. Other than that, a few of them have been designed by Masahiro Ito, known for his work designing monsters for the first 3 games. This is Sparta sign, Portal. So a very strange discovery was found among the many unused textures in Portal's files. A sign texture called wet_floor_sign, which showed a very dated meme reference from like 2009. Shout out to anyone old enough to remember this, honestly. But yeah, it's just a "This is Sparta" wet floor sign. Also, apparently this was featured in Source Filmmaker, which uses a lot of assets from Valve's games. However, that version of this wet floor sign is missing the text and image. So yeah, it's just a plain sign. Torture scene. Conker's Bad Fur Day. So yeah, in case you thought we were done with weird, creepy stuff in Conker's Bad Fur Day, Well, now we're back already. So yeah, apparently there was a torture scene that was going to be in the actual game. And yeah, it's not a kid's game, but even still, the developers must have thought that even with all of the crazy stuff in this game, that this was just too much. Much like that insane alternate ending that they had planned. Anyway, while the scene was cut, it was most likely cut pretty late in development, as the voice lines as well as animations for the scene were found, and ended up being put together in a version which can be watched on YouTube. Early Bianco Hills Pollution Map, Super Mario Sunshine. It's no secret that a lot of Mario games, for some reason, have some creepy stuff hidden in them, and Super Mario Sunshine is no exception to this, especially when we take a look at the early Bianco Hills Pollution Map, which shows this creepy image. There is also this texture of the goop as well, and an actual model of the map which shows its layout. Pretty basic and definitely something that was done early on in development, but this image, I can see why it remained buried in the files. Duel over Toluca Lake, Silent Hill Homecoming. This refers to something that was revealed by a former employee of Konami named Tom Hollett, who eventually became the director of the Silent Hill games. And that was a planned section of the game Silent Hill Homecoming, in which there would be a big battle over Toluca Lake. But needless to say, he didn't like this idea. In fact, let me just read you his quote about this. Quote, "The big end scene that they were planning was sort of this big showdown between Josh, who represented water, and Alessa, who represented fire. And you'd have sort of a Super Saiyan battle over Toluca Lake," end quote. Yikes. Definitely different from the more low-key horror experience this series started out as. Unicorn Fountain, Ocarina of Time. The Unicorn Fountain is a later removed and early version of the Great Fairy Fountain found in Ocarina of Time. This would be where Link would get the sword beam as well as be able to heal like a fairy fountain, although this was only in the beta version of the game. And in the final version, this fountain is unused, so it's been subject to a lot of speculation over the years. Pip's Skull, South Park: The Stick of Truth. Found within the GFX files of South Park: The Stick of Truth, the skull of the South Park character Pip can be found, and it's unknown what this texture would have been used for, although some think it was going to be a weapon of some kind. English Seaside, Little Big Planet. This cut location was found in a PS3 dev kit using a regular version of the game, which was shown by A on YouTube, where he shows gameplay exploring the location, which consisted of 3 levels which were found, those being the port, Out at Sea, and the depths, including 2 minigames, Pirate Ship Race and Underwater Jetpack Score Challenge. And a theme called Tea by the Sea was going to be used as the song for this area, although as the location wasn't officially included, it was instead sold in the Music Pack 1 DLC. Scoop Bloop, Mario and Luigi Partners in Time. In the press kit material for the release of this game, there were some early screenshots which showed Mario and Luigi as babies, fighting variants of blooper enemies called Scoop Bloops. However, when the game released, these enemies were nowhere to be found, although there is code that was found in the game that suggests that they were supposed to indeed appear, although they were scrapped at some point in development. There were also some sprites of these cut enemies which were found and ripped from the game. Trying to actually spawn in and fight them in the game, however, would soft lock or even crash your game, so they definitely weren't totally finished before they were cut. Bike concept art, Mario Kart Wii. Okay, so this is another pretty basic Nintendo concept art one. Essentially just ideas and concepts that never made it into the final game, such as this page which shows various different bikes which were planned but were never actually made or put into the game. Beaver Animatronic, Five Nights at Freddy's. So Scott Cawthon, the original creator of Five Nights at Freddy's, has been making games for a while, and before he made this insanely popular indie horror hit, he was making a lot, and I mean a lot, of other weird games, among which was called Chipper and Sons Lumber Co. Why am I giving all this lore? Well, because originally Five Nights at Freddy's was going to feature a so far unnamed Beaver animatronic, presumably similar to Chipper as the major antagonist. Although Scott did later change his mind, as he wanted the game to have a different identity, and not just be the character from a previous game. However, he was still going to appear, just not as the main one, and would have likely filled the role of Foxy before he ended up just being cut from the game entirely. Wolf animatronic, Five Nights at Freddy's. Another unnamed animatronic planned for the first game, this wolf animatronic was an early concept for the role of Foxy, although that was later scrapped. However, I guess a similar idea was used in the Twisted Ones novel, with the character of Twisted Wolf, as well as maybe even the character of Roxanne Wolf, who appears in the latest edition of the series, Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. Unnamed Beta Gang, GTA 3. Okay, so you guys probably know by now, but yeah, Rockstar kind of has the most interesting secrets and cut content, let's be real. But seriously, GTA 3 in particular has some real gems. In fact, I'm kinda shocked that Darkle didn't make it on this Iceberg. But that's okay, because one day I plan on covering everything related to that cut character. And trust me, it's one of the craziest things I've ever heard of, even coming from Rockstar. But back to the unnamed beta gang. So this was a gang that was cut before the game was finished, although they were featured in a few screenshots of the game early on. However, this unknown gang is thought to most likely be a Hispanic street gang operating in Liberty City. Not too much is known about this gang apart from what we've seen in screenshots, but like everything else found in GTA games, they've been subject to a lot of speculation, from being an early version of the Diablos to an early version of the Triads, or even being possibly a terrorist group, which was thought to be cut due to the widespread effects of 9/11. One of the most popular theories, though, is that the Beta Gang was actually supposed to be the Zaibatsu Corporation, which was an antagonistic crime faction from GTA 2. This is mainly theorized due to posters of the corporation, which were spotted in Chinatown, where the gang was meant to spawn. Orlando and Renzo Caruso, Hitman. The Caruso brothers, Orlando and Renzo, were planned but cut targets from 2016's Hitman, which had a full mission, including voice lines. The in-game briefing describes the pair as the overseers of a notorious drug cartel, and that you will be tasked with eliminating the brothers, as well as finding out why they were in Morocco. And it's not really known why this section was cut, although it's thought to be because it was either too easy or too similar to another mission called The Twin, involving a pair of brothers, although in that one only one of them is the target, making it harder as you have to kill the correct one. Original ending, Mother 3. Okay, so I'm not gonna spoil the ending of Mother 3, so if you want to play it, you definitely can. But let me just say the ending is pretty dark in its own right, but somehow, yeah, the original ending was going to be much darker, based on some unused sprites of the Masked Man, as well as statements by Itoy himself, the creator of the game. It's thought that not only this ending, but the whole game would have been much darker when it was originally worked on for the N64. Until that project was cancelled, before ultimately transitioning to the Game Boy Advance in 2003, at which point some of the story elements were tweaked, including most notably this darker ending. Mr. Burns' mansion interior and other unused areas, The Simpsons Hit and Run. There's a ton of cut content from Simpsons Hit and Run, from unused vehicles, to missions, to voice clips, sound effects, music, graphics, models, gameplay mechanics, and of course, areas. One of those being the interior of Mr. Burns' mansion, which can be accessed in the game through exploits or hacks. But there really isn't any interactivity to it at all, as well as a lack of props. However, it's thought that the mansion was originally going to be part of a mission in level 1 at some point, where Homer confronts Mr. Burns. Another area found in level 7, called the 939 area, was cut mostly due to time constraints, and it can actually still be accessed by getting out of bounds, where some leftover assets can still be found. And lastly, there is the Springfield nuclear power plant interior, also found in level 7, which is blocked off in the final version but can still be accessed via cheats. Although there really isn't much at all to this area, and it was probably scrapped pretty early on in the development of this level. Giant Chicken, Portal 2. Okay, Portal has had some weird discoveries and unused content over its lifespan, but I think this one takes the cake. So yeah, there was a giant chicken that was planned to be included in Portal 2. But not only that, some think it was actually going to be a sort of boss fight. That's right, and would even try to attack and kill the player. 5 sounds were actually found related to this cut entity, as well as a HUD icon for the chicken. Although maybe this could all just be a reference to the game F-Stop, which was a kind of cancelled prequel to Portal, which didn't actually have portals, but still involved aperture science testing, and a lot of features and characters and such as Cave Johnson, made it into Portal 2 from this prequel. And there was also supposed to be a giant chicken, who was one of the test subjects in the game, and he is even depicted in a piece of concept art. Pretty wild stuff, even for Valve. Original ending, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. So again, I'm going to be brief on this, mostly because I've never played this game and I would have no idea what I'm talking about. Broadly speaking though, let's just say this game had a lot of changes and things that were cut, including the ending of the game during development. And there is a huge blog spot going into this ending and what was changed and whatnot. So if you want to check it out, be sure to do so, but all of this goes into the lore of the games and the many characters, so if you're a fan of this game, definitely take a look. Post-game content, Fallout New Vegas. Oh boy, where do I start here? I mean, with regards to cut Fallout New Vegas content, you could literally dive into this for hours upon hours. I mean, just look at these videos. Yeah, these are great by the way. Go check them out if you're ever interested in learning more about New Vegas. But specifically today, we're going to touch on the post-game content which was cut. Because, well, as you'll know if you've ever beaten the game, after you achieve the ending of your choice, it's over. You can't continue to free roam, you either have to load a previous save before the final battle, or just start a whole new playthrough. It wasn't always going to be this way though. Basically, without getting into any spoilers, because if you haven't played this game, you need to play it right now. At the end of the game, the setting, the Mojave Wasteland, completely changes, as well as the locations and factions you encounter. And so that's why the game just ends. However, at some stage, there was actually going to be post-game content. You could continue playing with that playthrough, and the world, factions, and New Vegas itself would be affected by the choices you made during the playthrough, which would have been really cool. There was even a mod for New Vegas called the Functional Postgame Ending mod, which fulfills that very purpose, even giving characters new dialogue and cut lines from the game. Bestiary Test, Terraria. A pretty straightforward one again. This test creature, known as the Bestiary Test, was used most likely for debugging purposes in early development of the Bestiary. However, he is unused in the actual game. Early story levels, Little Big Planet PSP. Through an early alpha build of the PlayStation Portable version of Little Big Planet dated July 29th, 2009, there was found to be a debug feature which granted access to an early version of the story mode, including 3 levels, those being Introduction, Walkabout, and Gift of the Grab, all 3 of which are available for download as of now in an ISO file. Unused Enemies, Mega Man NES series. Okay, so since this covers all the Mega Man NES titles, which there's 6 in total, so yeah, kind of a lot, there's quite a few cut or unused characters from these games, but I will go through most of the interesting ones. For Mega Man 1, there were the Springers, which were first introduced in Mega Man 2, although there was artwork showing that they were actually planned for the first game. For Mega Man 2, there were sketches of a bird enemy and a magnet enemy, which were never actually used. Likewise, Mega Man 3 had various concept enemies, including the Berettan, which was basically a 9mm Beretta handgun, which is kinda wild to be honest, for a kid's game at that time. In Mega Man 4, there was an entire unused mini-boss, which would have been a part of the Pharaoh Man stage, appearing as a Sphinx type of boss. Mega Man 5 had a ton of various different assets and animations related to unused enemies, which was mostly made up of bomber-type enemies. But there is more to dig into here if you're really curious, but those were some of the more interesting ones, I think. Mario Tennis Galaxy, Super Mario Galaxy. Within the files of Super Mario Galaxy, a bunch of unused or cut animations for Mario were found, such as similar moves to that of Super Mario 64. But what this entry concerns are Mario's tennis animations, to which he had an entire tennis moveset which was found. Perhaps there was a tennis minigame or something that was planned for Galaxy, but we simply don't really know as of now. Soccer Ball, Battle for Bikini Bottom. A simple model found within the files of BFBB, this soccer ball was an early version of the throwable fruits, which Patrick uses throughout the game, as it can be seen on the same plant where the fruit spawns. It can also be found in many early screenshots from the game, although it's thought that it was most likely a placeholder, unless soccer balls growing underwater is a normal occurrence, I guess. Unused enemies, Super Mario RPG. Now granted, a lot of these are simply palette swaps of other enemies, but even so, there are a lot of enemies that didn't make it into the final version, which were found in the files. And I'll go through some of them right now. There's the chomp weed, which looks kind of similar to piranha plants, as well as some unfinished enemies that barely have anything attached to them, despite having some animation. And as for palette swaps, there's a bunch. I'll scroll through now so you can see, but yeah, just different colored enemies with slightly changed names, basically. F-Zero AX assets and F-Zero GX. So not only is there code and even assets from F-Zero AX found in F-Zero GX, but there is an actual F-Zero AX game mode found inside of F-Zero GX. And yeah, this all sounds very confusing, I know, but basically F-Zero GX is the GameCube counterpart to the arcade game F-Zero AX. But they're not the same game. Like, they didn't just port an arcade game to the GameCube. They were just being developed using the same code and almost identical hardware, so yeah, very similar games, but not actually the same game. So yeah, you can play the arcade version on the GameCube using cheat codes. Gorilla, Baldi's Basics. This cut character is a little more obscure and not much at all is known about it, other than that in the code for the farm field trip level of Baldi's Basics Plus, there are references to a number of animals in the code, such as a chicken, cow, pig, sheep, and of course the gorilla, which never actually made it into the game. Why this was scrapped or how it would have been implemented still remains unknown. Sunglasses Toad, Super Mario Sunshine. Another basic but cut model from Super Mario Sunshine is known as this internally in the files, and based on the appearance they seem to be sunglasses, which would be worn by Toad. Although none of the Toads in the game are ever seen wearing these sunglasses. Cut Psychopaths, Dead Rising 4. So in Dead Rising 4, they made the change from calling psychopaths, which are found in all the games, to be called maniacs instead. Although they essentially operate in the same way, being a sort of antagonistic human force that players encounter throughout the game. It can also be noted that Dead Rising 4 has way less maniacs or psychopaths than the rest of the series, which has led to some speculation that maybe some of them were cut during development, or this entry could simply refer to the name change. Super Mario Bros. 3 Centaur Power-Up. So this one's extremely simple, so there's not a lot to talk about here, but basically during the development of Super Mario Bros. 3, a power-up was briefly considered in which Mario would actually turn into a centaur, which is a half-horse, half-man hybrid, although this idea ended up being rejected. Perfect Head, Perfect Dark. So this was a cut feature that would actually allow players to import pictures from the Game Boy camera to the N64, using a transfer pack. And this would be used in Perfect Dark to apply these images onto the heads of guards in the game. The head models could also be manipulated as well, with options such as reshaping it, as well as even selecting a hairstyle for it. However, this feature was cancelled due to, quote, insurmountable technical problems. Although apparently the feature was fully functional at one point during the game's development. However, there is no code in the game that remains tied to Perfect Head. Although there is some in-game text that was found using a GameShark code, which shows a lot of the options that could be tweaked when using this feature. Wolfchanza 1944 Leftovers in M&M's Kart Racing. So in M&M's Kart Racing, a pretty innocuous shovelware racing game for the Wii, there were found to be some files relating to another game, Wolfchanza 1944, a World War II first-person shooter developed by Calaris Studios, which shared a lot of staff members with Frontline Studios who made M&M's Kart Racing. And among the files were just various screenshots of gameplay, as well as some loading screens, HUDs, and other such assets. Wallace and Gromit Leftovers and Gubble Buggy Racer. Another racing game with leftover assets. This time though, the assets belong to a Wallace and Gromit racing game, which was being developed by Data Design Interactive, before the game was changed to Gubble Buggy Racer instead, which is a pretty obscure racing game released in 2000. However, the project originally started as a Wallace and Gromit game, and some of these assets can be found in the files, which were from the original pitch demo, which can be seen here. And there were also these descriptions of the Wallace and Gromit characters who were probably planned to be playable in the game. Original Mario and Luigi voice actors, Hotel Mario. So Hotel Mario was one of the first games to feature voice acting in the Mario series, and because of this, the iconic voice of the Italian plumber done by Charles Martinet, or Martinet however you pronounce it, that everyone recognizes, is not in this game. Instead, Mario, Luigi, and Bowser were all voiced by Mark Grau, who had a very different interpretation of the characters. But even before this, there was some other audio which was found in the files belonging to a different voice of the characters. Although it's been noted that they sound similar to Mario cartoon series versions of the characters.
You know, I think maybe that Roy is a pretty good sport after all.
What do you mean?
See? He's waving goodbye.
All right.
Dirty Disc Message, Link the Faces of Evil, and Zelda the Wand of Gamelon. Ah yes, two more great CDI games. So in two of the three Zelda titles released for the CDI, there was a kind of strange cut feature which would have featured the voice actors of Link and Zelda telling the player that their game disc was dirty, and the steps that they should take to clean it.
Hey, I think your game disc is dirty. Try ending the game and cleaning your disc.
Hey, I think your disc is dirty. Try ending the game and cleaning your disc.
And it wasn't only the English voice actors either. They recorded lines for many different languages. Super Mario Bros. Shoot 'em up sections. Yes, you heard that right. According to an interview with Shigeru Miyamoto, it was said that in the original control scheme for the first Super Mario Bros., that up on the D-pad would jump, B would do a dash move, and A would actually shoot, as in fire bullets. He even said about this, quote, "We originally thought about having a shoot 'em up stage, where Mario jumps on a cloud and shoots at enemies, but we dropped it because we wanted to focus on the jumping action." The sky-based bonus stages are the remnants of that idea, you could say. So yeah, SMB almost had a shooting stage before that mechanic was eventually tweaked and changed into the fireball. Pretty interesting stuff. KGB Troops, Alien Hominid. So Alien Hominid is a pretty old Newgrounds game, but eventually it was given a console release, and the developers have gone on to make some really good and popular games. Some that you might even recognize, like Castle Crashers and Battle Block Theater. Anyway though, so in the actual game files of the original Flash version, there was found to be these fully developed animations of KGB troops, as they were likely planned to appear in the game, although of course they never did. Not too strange considering you fight FBI troops in the game, but interesting nonetheless. Link Mask, Majora's Mask. So simply enough, inside the code of Majora's Mask, there was a model of a mask that was found which was of Child Link. And although it isn't used anywhere in the base game, it actually can be used by Skull Kid, by using a certain gecko code in the English version of the game, which will make Skull Kid use this mask instead of Majora's Mask. Bond Man, Mega Man. This was a robot master and boss that was planned to be included in the original Mega Man game as one of the stage bosses. However, he was eventually scrapped as the amount of stage bosses was cut down from 8 to just 6. However, one of his mechanics was used for the Ice Slasher, that being his special weapon that would freeze enemies. Extra character trophies, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. So Super Smash Bros. Brawl already has a ton of trophies in the game, but apparently there were some extra character trophies which were not actually included in the game, which may have been referenced in the game's code, such as a Ridley Assist trophy. But there were also even unused models of playable characters which were found in the ISO file of Brawl, which were showcased in a video by Sean the Squirrel on YouTube. Rhythm Heaven Megamix Test Minigame. In the Japanese version of Rhythm Heaven Megamix, quite a few graphics and animations were found relating to a test minigame. These included sprites for a background, as well as sprite sheets for various characters, and there even were some animations of these characters, dancing, punching, kicking, and doing other various things. There were also animations for enemies as well, and a character called Boss, as he's named in the files. Okoru, Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. There is an unused enemy within the files of Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, known simply as the file name Okoru, which means roughly to get angry in Japanese, which possibly would have had something to do with that meter rising on his head as he got angry. However, we don't know for sure, as this image is the only thing that was found in the files of this cut enemy. Dildo Weapon, Manhunt 2. Oh boy, so yeah, in Manhunt 2 there is actually a dildo weapon which was found. More specifically, the model was found in a PS2 beta version of the game, while the sounds and animations relating to executions with this weapon were found in the PC version, where it was eventually restored, and you can watch the executions on YouTube, but I'm not going to show them here as they are very violent and graphic. However, I'll go into all the cut weapons and executions of Manhunt in another video, where I will actually show all of these animations and stuff, so stay tuned for that. Or you can just look them up on YouTube if you're curious. Fahrenheit Indigo Prophecy was meant to be 2 games. So Fahrenheit was developed for over 2 years by a company called Quantic Dream of over 80 employees. And interestingly, the script of the game was completed in just 1 year by the writer and director of the game, David Cage. And the script was a whopping 2,000 pages, which is pretty insane. However, this might have also been because the game was originally planned as a kind of episodic title, which would have had many writers working on it with a planned total of 12 installments. Although the director, David Cage, didn't really like this idea and moved away from it, taking their narrative and plot and making it into just 1 game. So I'm not really too sure what it means by 2 games. Really, it was originally going to be 12 different episodes or installments, before that ended up being changed. Unused effects, Yume Nikki. In the game Yume Nikki, the protagonist, Madotsuki, has access to 24 effects throughout the game, which alter her appearance and grant her special abilities. And well, there were some planned effects that went unused in the game. First, there was the blindfold, and we don't actually know what it would have done, but we can probably guess it had something to do with her ability to see. Next, there was the grayscale, which would turn her sprite into a monochrome color scheme. And it's not really known what this would have done, although it's speculated that she might have appeared as this in the white desert area. And lastly is the Will-O-the-Wisp, which would have turned her into a flame-like spirit, although it's not really known what effect this would have had in the game. Spaceman, LEGO Star Wars: The Complete Saga. In the LEGO Star Wars: The Complete Saga, released for Windows in October of 2009, there was an unused character which was found called simply Spaceman, who is simply thought to be some sort of test character that might have been used in the original LEGO Star Wars, as some of his features aren't fully modeled correctly, such as his face as it only has 1 eye. Chef Ghost, Luigi's Mansion. Originally, in the first Luigi's Mansion game for the Nintendo GameCube, there was planned to be a chef ghost found in the kitchen area, although this was eventually scrapped before release, although he can be seen in early pre-release screenshots. However, in Luigi's Mansion 3, released in 2019, there is an official chef ghost boss fight. Maya the Bee and her friends was originally South Park GBC. Wait a minute, what? Yeah, okay, so this game right here, this kid-friendly puzzle game based on a German cartoon, was actually initially a South Park game developed for the Game Boy Color. How do we know this? Well, first of all, a Game Shark code can be used to open up a hidden menu in the game, which is the same one that can be found in the South Park game prototype. But that's not all. Actually, several graphics from the South Park game were found in the Maya game ROM, such as these characters from South Park, as well as this character who looks pretty similar to Itchy from The Simpsons, so not sure why he's in here to be honest. And eventually that lost South Park prototype was found and released as a ROM in 2018, and you can see the various similarities between the 2 games. although the South Park game was cancelled because Nintendo and the creators of South Park didn't think it was appropriate to release an adult game for a system mainly played by children. Board game, Bug Fables: The Everlasting Sapling. So in Bug Fables, a game heavily inspired by the Paper Mario series, there were some unused and cut arcade games that were Mario Party-like minigames, such as one called Board Game in the files, which had some text and sprites related to it that were found, as well as some screenshots which show what the gameplay might have looked like. Peter Pan, Disney Infinity. Peter Pan was a planned but ultimately cut character from Disney Infinity 3.0, and was scrapped due to the cancellation of Disney Infinity by the game's developer, Avalanche Software. And so not much else is known about the character, as there is no gameplay footage at all that exists. However, there is a brief description that reads, quote, "Neverland's favorite lost boy uses his acrobatic flying skills while wielding his dependable dagger." And just to be clear, in case you haven't heard of Disney Infinity or how it works, which I wouldn't blame you, I didn't have any idea until I read up on this, but the characters have actual physical action figures that are used to play the characters by placing them on a Disney Infinity base, similar to something like Skylanders or Amiibos, something like that. But yeah, there were actually a couple of Peter Pan figures which were actually made and now are extremely rare and valuable if you can manage to even find one. GTA Classic was an open world sandbox with dinosaurs. Wow, okay, so apparently the first GTA game developed by Rockstar was originally going to be an open world game with dinosaurs. So yeah, this series has definitely had an interesting evolution. Now originally, GTA as we know it was called Race and Chase, and was a concept for a game about simply cars and driving, without the, Grand Theft Auto part. Although there was still going to be crime, as it was planned to be a multiplayer game with bank robbery missions, where you could play as either the cops or the robbers. And there were also going to be just cops around the map who would chase you, all that stuff, and you're probably thinking, well, that's all great, but where are the dinosaurs? Well, in the prototypes of the game provided by one of the developers, Mike Daly, it was found that there was a demo called Dino, which was from another prototype called Attack, which was a game about dinosaurs supposedly rampaging through a city. And even in the files of the final release of Grand Theft Auto, a file relating to this can be found called dino.bat. Level 8 and 9, The Simpsons Hit and Run. So this one's really simple, but essentially in the various files relating to levels in the game, there were folders found for levels 8 and 9, although in the final game there are only 7 levels, and looking inside these folders reveals nothing. So yeah, just 2 empty folders, although I guess this does imply that at some point 2 more levels were planned for the game. Ahsoka and Padme, Star Wars Battlefront 2. So in 2020, Star Wars Battlefront 2 got its last major update and ended support for future heroes being added to the game, which is a shame, as it was promised by the creative director of the game that more female heroes would be introduced into the game. However, in 2019, he said that he regretted that comment, as he shouldn't make such risky promises like that, and unfortunately, fan-favorite characters like Ahsoka and Padme, which many thought were going to be added, never were, despite being rumored and even references to them being data mined in the files. Unused audio, Doom 64. In the Nintendo 64 version of Doom, first released in 1997, there were found to be a couple of unused audio clips, those being these sounds. The first 2 being unused due to technical limitations, and the last 2 going unused because they were related to the Revenant enemy from Doom 2, which didn't make it into the game due to storage constraints. Morton and Lemmy voices, Mario is missing. 2 of the Koopalings that are never featured throughout the game are Morton and Lemmy, who actually did have some voice lines which were recorded that were found in the files. So here are just a couple of them.
You know, Luigi, a smart guy like you ought to join up with the winners. Here's a nice turtle shell you can wear. If you can't defeat us, you might as well join us. What's a nice plumber like you doing in a place like this? With your talent, you ought to be unclogging drains somewhere, not trying to embarrass yourself as a detective.
Go away, plumber's helper! The only place you'll see your brother's face is on a milk carton! The cold truth of the matter is, this turtle is only afraid of one thing. And it's one thing you haven't got, buddy. Fire flowers!
Crying baby audio, Dark Souls 3. Okay, so this is very disturbing, like, really. So I'm not going to play the whole audio, but if you want to listen to the entire thing, you can easily find it on YouTube. But essentially, these are cut lines of an infant crying, which would have played during the Osiros boss fight. Osiros? I don't know how you say that. And you might be thinking, what's so bad about that? It's just a baby crying. It's a little weird, but nothing too bad, right? Well, yeah, let's just say that that's not all that happens. I mean, listen to the rest of the audio if you want, but be warned, yeah, it sounds like something happens to said baby. Yeah, moving on. Old Essentia Dungeon and Old Sewer Dungeon. YIIK, a postmodern RPG. Now, admittedly, I don't know much at all about this game, so I'm going to kind of just briefly explain what I know about these two entries and combine them here into one. So I guess in the game there are two versions of dungeons which were cut from the game, those being the Old Sewer and Essentia dungeons, which were showcased in a YouTube video by Combat Lobster, where he showed all of the other cut content found within this game, so if this interests you, definitely go check it out. The Sonic the Hedgehog Band, Sega Sonic Bros. So interestingly, this game itself, Sega Sonic Bros, was never actually fully released in its own right, but essentially it was meant to be an arcade puzzle game. However, even though it didn't officially release, a ROM was found which can be played, and in this ROM was found the various sprites of Sonic band members, which if you remember from one of the previous parts of the Iceberg, was a concept that was planned for the first Sonic the Hedgehog game, but was never actually used. Poacher, Carnivore's Ice Age. The Poachers were planned human enemies in the game Carnivore's Ice Age, which were going to be human NPCs that would actually hunt the player. However, at some point they were scrapped. However, by editing a file in the game, it's possible to actually add the poacher back into the game. Minecarts storing items, Minecraft. So I guess this was a planned feature where minecarts would actually be able to store items like a chest. However, now in the game, there are minecarts with chests and minecarts with hoppers, which can be used in this very way. Purple Feathers, Angry Birds. So this is really kind of a basic one. Just some purple feather textures which were found in the PC version of Angry Birds, which was seen as a hint by fans that a new purple bird was coming to the game. However, that bird was never released as far as I'm aware. Terrorist attack image in Mario Kart Arcade GP. Alright, the final tier coming right out of the gate with some weird stuff. Great. So yeah, in Mario Kart Arcade GP, a couple of images were found called CamTest00, CamTest01, and CamTest02.jpg. The first one was a simple color test, and the second was of mascots at an expo in Japan, and the third one was, well, a picture of a real-life school hostage crisis where 1,100 people were taken hostage in a school in Beslan, North Ossetia. Now, why was this specific image used? Even if it was just for testing purposes, who knows? Personalized Pikmin AI. I'm serious. Basically, in the original Pikmin game released for the Nintendo GameCube in 2001, it was stated by Miyamoto in an interview about the game that it was actually discussed and planned that there would be sentient Pikmin AI, and that it would actually adapt to how you played the game, and could even disobey the player. Although in testing, this kind of feature was found to be more annoying for players than anything else. Still, it's really interesting though. Anguillus, Godzilla Monster of Monsters. So there were two monsters which were cut from the game that were also going to be playable, those being Anguillus and Rodan. And Anguillus can actually still be accessed in the game by freezing this RAM address at 03, whatever that means, which allows Anguillus to be in a mostly playable state, although he lacks attack animations and he can't be damaged by enemies and can even sometimes completely crash the game. Rodan, Godzilla Monster of Monsters. So yeah, this was the other unused and cut playable character in Godzilla Monster of Monsters, who could also be accessed by freezing the same RAM address, but this time at 02. Although Rodan is in an even less playable state than Anguillus, and fights against monsters with this character will simply crash the game. However, the sprites of Rodan do exist in both the Japanese and international versions of the game. Unknown Nintendo Employee Pictures. Super Mario 64 on Nintendo 64 disk drive. So this is referring to a version of Super Mario 64 that was planned to be released for the Nintendo 64 DD or disc version, and it was showcased on the unit at a Nintendo show in 1996. But basically found within the files of the game were some unused graphics, and among them were these images of what is assumed to be an unknown Nintendo employee who has still yet to be identified. And it's unknown why these images are even in the files. Propeller hat in Super Mario Bros. So this refers to the idea that in Super Mario Bros. 1, the propeller cap was a planned feature, or at least something that was looked into conceptually, which can be seen in these rough sketches dating back to the development of SMB1, which shows a propeller hat, similar to the one seen many years later in New Super Mario Bros. Wii. Naked Woman. Blasto. So Blasto is a third-person shooter game released in 1998 for the PlayStation 1, where you play the role of Captain Blasto as you platform and fight aliens. Now there were a couple of unused images that were found in the files of this game, some just being simple copyright notice screens and some just being placeholder images. But also in the files was found an image of a fully nude woman, which I obviously can't show here on YouTube, but yeah, it exists. And someone left it in there for whatever reason. Whoops. Tokone, Kirby and the Amazing Mirror prototype. While there are a bunch of unused and cut assets found in the prototype of Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, there is only one unused enemy, and that is Tokone. Probably butchering that name, but yeah. Only its sprites as well as its name have been found within the ROM. And it's thought that this is a kind of clock-like enemy, simply based on its design. Redneck Kong, Diddy Kong Pilot. Okay, so this is a bit of a weird one, but there was a prototype of a now cancelled racing game called Diddy Kong Pilot that was being developed for the Game Boy Advance in 2001. However, this game was never actually released, and this prototype was actually eventually turned into Banjo Pilot, which released in 2005 for the Game Boy Advance. However, a ROM of one of the builds of Diddy Kong Pilot was found in 2013. And on this ROM, a lot of interesting content was found that was actually cut from the version of Diddy Kong Pilot that was shown off in 2001. And one of those things was a character called Redneck Kong, who appeared on the character selection menu and could be highlighted, although he could not actually be selected. Hat Kong / Fedora Kong, Donkey Kong Land. There are quite a few characters that were meant to be included in Donkey Kong Land, but were eventually cut at some point and went unused. And one of those is this Kong, that is not actually officially named, but has been called Hat Kong and Fedora Kong by fans, who, like those names suggest, is seen wearing a fedora-like hat. Not much else, though, is known about this cut character. Tiara Boobowski, Sonic Extreme. So this pertains to another cancelled and unreleased game, which is Sonic Extreme, which was going to be the first 3D Sonic game developed for the Sega Saturn. However, the project was eventually cancelled, although many builds of the game have surfaced over the years, showing what the game might have looked like, as well as the cut content itself. And one of the new characters that was going to be featured in the game was Tiara Boobowski. Yes, that was her actual name. And she was intended to be a love interest for Sonic, as well as one of the 4 planned playable characters. And there's a lot of concept art showing what the character was planned to look like. Secret Passwords, Dick Vitale's Awesome Baby College Hoops. What an interesting name for a basketball game. Anyway, this concerns some secret passwords that were left in the game by developers, either as an Easter egg or by accident. But basically, there's codes that would change the names of the people on your team, such as these for example. I like this one, the White House with a bunch of presidents, and then at the bottom for some reason you've got the CIA, FBI, and the NSA. Why they couldn't think of any more presidents, I don't know. But shout out to the CIA, best point guard in the game. Potential Kool-Aid Man appearance, Family Guy back to the multiverse. So I'm pretty sure this refers to the idea that the Kool-Aid Man was planned to make an appearance in the Family Guy video game released in 2012, Back to the Multiverse. This is probably theorized because the Kool-Aid Man has made many appearances in the actual show, and was voiced by Seth MacFarlane in pretty much all of these appearances. So it's possible that at one point a cameo for the character was also planned for the game, but at some point was cancelled. Carmageddon Forever logo in Wacky Races, Crash and Dash's files. In the files of a Wii racing game titled Wacky Races, Crash and Dash, there was found this graphic which was of what looks like a menu to a game called Carmageddon Forever. However, this game does not exist. And so it's theorized that this may have been the original title and menu for this game before it was changed. Unused graphics, Tecmo Night. Okay, not gonna lie, this one kind of shocked me when I looked into it, because that's a pretty unassuming title for this entry, like a lot of others on this list. But if you've never actually played this game like I have, yeah, the game's pretty gory and violent, and it's an arcade-style beat-em-up released in the 1980s. And even in the opening sequence of the game, you see two characters get killed in a particularly brutal fashion. But right before you can actually see the gore, it cuts to a silhouetted image. But, well, it turns out there are actual graphics of these scenes, and yeah, they are pretty gory. Unused tracks, Jet Moto 2124. So yet again, another game that was never finished or fully released, as this title, Jet Moto 2124, was meant to be a sequel to Jet Moto 3, but due to issues during development, the project had to be cancelled. Although an early ROM was found of the game in 2014. And in it, a couple of unused and changed tracks were found. Tracks as in like maps, such as Atlantis 2, Neo Rio, which can actually be loaded without the game crashing, Pacific Ocean, and a test track, which can be accessed in the ROM via codes. Gamers Hell screenshots, Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius. Okay, so that name sounds kind of ominous, but really it's not. This is just a pretty basic one. So before the release of Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius on Windows in 2001, there was actually a much earlier build that was different from the one that was seen on release. And screenshots of this build were made available from a website called gamershell.com. And there are a couple of differences in models and mapping, most notably the character model of Jimmy, which looks much more accurate and less horrifying in the final release. Shark Enemy, Little Red Hood. So this pertains to an old unlicensed NES game released in 1989 called Little Red Hood. That's kind of infamous for being unfinished and, well, not good. But yeah, this was a basic sprite which was found that is supposedly of a shark enemy. But I don't know if it's just me, but that looks nothing like a shark. But hey, it was the NES days, so it gets a pass, I guess. Proto, Battle of the Eras. Battle of the Eras is a pretty obscure fighting game, with quotes, that was made for DOS in 1995. So Proto isn't actually a prototype build of the game like you might assume. It's actually a secret character that can be fought in the arcade mode by holding space before the match starts. However, when you try to select the character in versus mode, he can only be selected by the second player. And once you try to start the match with him selected, it will just crash the game. Prototype cutscenes, Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights. Now this is a pretty interesting one. So this Scooby-Doo game released for the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox is kind of a standard platformer game of the time. But it's one I grew up playing and remember pretty fondly. That being said though, it's very interesting that instead of 3D cutscenes, which we had in the final release, the prototype of this game actually had fully 2D animated cutscenes, which were even storyboarded in-house by Hanna-Barbera. And there are 50 of these which have been found, and even though it would be kind of jarring to switch from 2D animated cutscenes to 3D gameplay, it's kind of weird that they would go through all the effort to make these and not actually use them in game. All of the Town with No Names unused content. Oh boy, so where do we begin with this? First of all, this game is pretty wild on its own, and it's kind of gone on to become a meme for how weird and, yeah, just weird it is. But there's a bunch of unused content with this game, so let's just get into it. First, there is an unused language select screen, which features languages in a globe-like shape or something for some reason. Then there's some random animations, some test and placeholder graphics, and just some really weird and confusing images. Like this one. Like, what am I even looking at right now? And there's also a ton of unused random voice lines from the characters in this game, such as this.
Were you born stupid, or did you have to learn to play this bad?
And some music that was also cut, such as this gem. What a slapper. Monster Party Prototype. Monster Party is another NES game released in 1989, and it's kind of a weird platforming game about, well, monsters. But there was a Japanese prototype of this game that was for a long time only in the hands of collectors, until it was finally released to the public on January 3rd, 2014, with the original title, Parody World Monster Party. And there's quite a bit of small differences, such as different color palettes for scenes and menus, and some slightly different level layouts, but there were some other pretty interesting things that were cut, such as various parodies and references to other media that likely had to be cut to avoid copyright issues, such as a Planet of the Apes style boss fight which was swapped out for a simple and pretty boring looking pumpkin boss. There was also a mummy-like boss, which was for some reason changed, maybe due to its association with the Mummy film from 1932, but it's not like they invented mummies. They're not exactly protected by copyright. But anyway, there's also a gremlin from the movie Gremlins, which had to simply be changed to just a giant cat. And there was even a xenomorph-like boss from the movie Alien, which was changed to a Grim Reaper. And there are a couple more instances of changes here, but these are the ones I thought were the most interesting. Ninja Breadman was originally a Zool reboot. In the 1990s, there was a little series of platforming games called Zool, which were made for the Amiga and later ported to other consoles. Fast forward many years later, and the very strange platforming game for the Wii, released in 2005, called Ninja Breadman, was actually revealed to have started as an entry in the Zool series, as a reboot actually. However, after only a short amount of time in development, the reboot of Zool was cancelled, and instead 4 new games were going to be made in its place using various assets from the reboot, those being Anubis 2, Mythmakers, Trixie and Toyland, Rock'n'Roll Adventures, and Casper's Scare School. Oh, and of course, you can't forget the most infamous one, Ninja Breadman. And yeah, these games are kind of known for being shovelware, but interestingly, the animated intro of the Zool reboot was actually found, and it now can be viewed on YouTube. Game Boy printer support, Mario Artist Paint Studio. So this was another N64 disk drive game, released in Japan in 1999. It was a successor to the original Mario Paint game released on the SNES. And the game, through the use of a cable accessory which was never released, and the Game Boy printer would allow you to actually print things from the game, as can be seen in the printer icons which appear in the game's menu. There was also planned to be a Game Boy printer color that would be released that would allow you to print full color images, although that was not even announced, let alone released. Sonic and Tails playable, Mario Kart Double Dash. Released on the GameCube in 2003, Mario Kart Double Dash was the 3rd entry in the series, introducing cooperative land play to the game. But what we're talking about here today is that Sonic and Tails were once planned to be playable characters in the game. At least they were teased as such in 2002 by Shigeru Miyamoto himself, when in an interview he said that they wanted Sonic as one of the drivers. However, of course, when the game released, he was nowhere to be found in the roster. Unused content, cut voice line implying child victims. Manhunt 2. Jesus. So yeah, this game is already extremely dark and disturbing, but even so, some stuff was just too much and had to be cut. Like this cut audio, for example. Without getting into spoilers, because honestly I think this game is really underrated and you should give it a play if you can find it. Basically, one of the characters at some point has their children threatened, but you later find out that they were not actually harmed. However, that might not have always been the case, as, well, this very disturbing audio might suggest otherwise.
No! Please don't hurt me! Don't hurt the children! No! No! No!
Yeah, some pretty heavy and disturbing stuff. And that finally concludes this extremely long video. And if you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, and you made it all this way, please consider doing so. It really helps out the channel. And maybe check out some of my other videos, like this other Iceberg I did on fake lost media. And you can also follow me on Twitter at sourcebrew, but I'll stop with the plug segment. But I do have a ton of new videos in the works right now, so stay tuned for those. But that's pretty much it. Thanks again so much for watching. It's been me, Sourcebrew, and I'll see you guys next time.